We are starting. Good morning, everyone. Sorry for all this technology, but please just try to put it in the background. We're just trying to make sure we have as much access to everything for everyone as possible. And so we'll have to mix it up. Our couple of virtual people are here. Maybe we should move their name tags so that we know that they're online or something. I am Rebecca Flora, Secretary of the Department of Planning, newly came in January, and we'll do a round of introductions and everything in a little bit. But I want to, first of all, thank all of the staff here and know that, raise your hands, everybody. Thank you from the staff at MDP and everywhere else. If any, no, you're really raising your hands. Okay. The reason for that is anyone has any questions, if you have a need to get up at any point in time, please feel free to do so. This is a long meeting. We'll sort of gauge the energy level and take a break if we need to, somewhere during the 3 hours, wherever it seems to be a good breaking point, and just ensure that everyone has that opportunity. The other thing, few other logistics, restrooms are straight out the door, and you'll find those right to the left, I believe, and emergency exit, obviously, straight out to the front. Hopefully everyone figured that out on your way in. That has happened to me. I was actually had a tornado warning once during a lead workshop I was doing. So good to know. We had to go into shelter. We went into shelter in that case. It was a very interesting situation. And I also want to welcome everyone that came and joined us to visit, and anyone online. These hybrid meetings are great because we have a chance to, I think, include more people. On the other hand, it's a little difficult because you're really not sure who's out there and how to acknowledge them and whatnot. So those are just a couple of things I wanted to go over. The other thing is, before we jump into everything, is to just remind everyone the meeting is being recorded. And I'm going to be referring to Joe Griffiths over here quite a bit, who is really overseeing this whole process, and we'll be able to answer the questions that I can't answer. But Joe, are we going to be uploading the recording to the website, right? To the web page? We will. Okay, so that'll be there. So we're using it more as reference, and once again, to make things available to the public for this process. And there is a comment form on that web page also. So anyone from the public or anyone out there, virtual land, know that you can provide us added comments that we will go through and make available as part of our deliberation process. So I just wanted to kind of make that note also. I think that's the most of the housekeeping. Joe, did I forget anything? You got it all?
The microphone.
Yes.
Sure that
Joe, your audio is low.
Right at the top, turn on the switch. So yes, those are why we've got all this technology and whatnot going on. So, okay, we've covered everything. The only other thing I would say is please turn off your phone. Understandable. This is, you're taking up valuable time. We want to use your time well, and we appreciate your time. Things come up. If you do need to take a call, just step out into the hallway, and aware that those things do happen. So just silence for the moment. So I think we're gonna go next into just kind of an opening round of introductions. Part of this process, which we'll get into when we get to the, let me just go ahead and advance if I can. Not working. There we go. Is it just delayed maybe? Can you advance for me, Joe? Where am I pointing? Maybe I'm just pointing in the wrong place. Okay. Before we get into introductions and go around, just so you'll know what's coming, is that today is going to be a lot about just getting oriented, getting to know who's here, why you're here, what we're all doing, getting a little bit of background information. So, we're going to go through what we've been assigned to, where that's coming to, what the legislation is about. Perhaps may or may not have time to read it in advance. So we'll go through it a little bit today. the timeline. You are dealing with planners who are running this process. We do believe in process, and we've sketched out a timeline so you can get a sense of the bigger picture here. Also, where we're headed, how we hope to get there. We do have a little bit of background and research to share with you today. We encourage all of you, if you have information or research or things that you feel like you can add, to share that with us. We're a small staff at planning, so we're happy to get volunteers in that process as we try to be as thorough and robust as we can be of taking all information into consideration. We will reserve time for discussion towards the end, and then we have reserved time for public comment, particularly for anyone who's in the room. It would be people virtual. We're putting it into the chat. Where are we putting the virtual comments? Into the what section?
For virtual comments, there is a commenting form. It's a Google form. It's been dropped in the chat. It's also available on our website. So we encourage people to submit comments via the Google form.
Right. So the comment period toward the end, which I will make sure we reserve time for, will be for anybody in the room that is still with us at that point, at the end of almost at the end of our 3-hour meeting. And so we'll try to keep on time. I'm fairly good at that, moving things along so that we get through everything. But that's the game plan for today. And I think the first part is getting to know who's here, because I believe that when a group is going to work together like this for what will be 9 to 10 months, it's good to really understand the other resources and assets we have in the room, who you are, perspective you're coming from. I think it's a really interesting group that was identified in the bill to really bring together a variety of perspectives and voices. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion that will come out of that. So I think what we'll do, Joe, if we can go to the folks on virtual first, perhaps, so we don't lose them. There's 2 task force members on virtual. 3. Okay, I'm
3
going to let
task
you
force
introduce
members.
those, and then we'll go around this table.
Okay. Well, I'll start with Lori Paris. Lori, if you could unmute and introduce yourself.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Lori Paris. I'm the Senior Advisor to the Department of Permitting, Inspections and Enforcement, and I'm looking forward to meeting everyone and working on this task force.
Lori, I see you there. It looks like you're unmuted.
Oh, did you just hear me?
We'll come back to you, Lori.
Can you hear me?
No worries. She's waving. All right.
We heard
Delegate
you.
Vaughn Stewart's
We heard
here
you.
as well.
Okay.
Delegate Stewart, we'll start with you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, because I could hear Lori. Okay. Well, I'm Delegate Vaughn Stewart. It's great to be with all of you this morning. I represent District 19 in Montgomery County in the Maryland House of Delegates, and I'm really looking forward to the work of this work group and looking forward to discussing this issue with everyone.
Thank you, Delegate Stewart. Now I'm realizing that I made a mistake, and I did not bring a speaker here to project their sound to you all. So my apologies.
No problem. On the to-do list for next time, along
Yes.
with a couple more chords. So bear with us. We'll get those on the list for next round. But I think we could hear it, and you can always put your mic up to the mic on the computer too. So go ahead to our next intro.
Lori.
Okay, I'll try this again. Good morning. My name is Lori Paris. I'm the Senior Advisor to the Director here at the Department of Permitting, Inspections and Enforcement in Prince George's County, and I'm looking forward to meeting everyone and working on the task force.
Thank you, Lori. Quinn Griffith.
Yes, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. I'm not sure about the rest of the folks in the room, but go ahead.
Great. I'll try to speak up as best as I can. So as you mentioned, I'm Quinn Griffith. I am a member of the Chesapeake chapter of CAI, which stands for the Community Associations Institute. I'm actually with the law firm of Whiteford, Taylor, and Preston. I practice law in Delaware as well as Maryland. I'm located on the eastern shore of Maryland. Been practicing for about 4 years now. So as most of the folks have said, I'm excited to get started with this task force, and I look forward to working with them.
Thank you, Quinn. And the last one joining virtually is James Gaston, the third.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Fantastic. James Gaston III. I am the town administrator for Brentwood, Maryland. For those who don't know, that's right on US 1, right outside the DC line. Mount Rainier, then Brentwood. So right there in the urban area. Thank you for having me, and I'm looking forward to the task force.
Thank you, Mr. Gaston. That's all the task force members on joining virtually.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, so now we can get to know each other in the room. And let's start with Amy, if you don't mind. Just introduction, a little bit about your background and why this might be relevant to you.
Good morning. I'm Amy Mordock. I'm the planning director in Queen Anne's County. I have been asked by Mako to sit on a number of committees during my years as a planner. I've been a planner on the Eastern Shore for 20 years and a planning director for about 10 of those years, and have grappled with housing issues, particularly in this case. Mako conducted a housing symposium last year, and I was able to participate in that symposium where there was a lot of good information shared. I don't know how many people who are attending today were engaged in that task force, but in a lot of ways, it felt like maybe a precursor to this task force being formed. I look forward to representing the rural perspective of the planning challenges to facilitate successful accessory dwelling unit provisions, affordable housing provisions. I have some diverse experiences as to what doesn't work. So I'm interested in hearing from everyone about programs that do work and coming up with some approaches that might lend toward more success in a rural community, but also in an urban community. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. And Joe, could you, this is an advancing, so I'm going to let you go ahead and just handle that. We can pull up the slide on the top of the members, perhaps. Thank you. I was in that. And I was one on the Eastern Shore also this morning. So yes, it was an interesting commute morning. So anyways, Priscilla.
Yeah, I'm Priscilla Kenya. I'm with AARP. I'm a volunteer lead advocate with AARP, and AARP really has livable communities and aging in place as a #1 priority. It's a very, very, very high priority. In fact, the most recent AARP magazine has a whole thing about successful ADUs, and the recent magazine has a lot of information and a lot of resources. I mean, there's so many resources. You could just go to the AARP website and there you get all your resources. So, you know, my personal experience, you know, when I think about ADUs, my grandparents were able to age in place because they turned their house into, you know, they added a unit upstairs so my aunt could come and live with them and they could stay in their house. I think it's something that's been done, never called ADUs in the past. It was in-law apartments and, you know, all different kinds of things that we called them, but they've always been around. And now it's just that you can't get them properly zoned and so on and inspected without zoning regulations. So it's important to me. It's important to us. And, you know, I'd really like to see this happen in the state of Maryland. And I live in Anne Arundel County. So you all know that Anne Arundel County has approved ADUs and the city of Annapolis has approved them. So, you know, at least we're 2 steps ahead of the game. Well, apparently there isn't a high demand yet in the city. Anne Arundel County only allowed it as of this year. So I don't even know the numbers. And one of my concerns is that Anne Arundel County is full of homeowners associations. And I'm very hopeful that that's something that we can address, because currently homeowners associations can say no matter what the law says, they don't allow it. Is that proper or is that not correct? And in some states, they have overridden that. They've said that homeowners associations don't have the right to outlaw ADUs. So we won't know for another year or 2 how it's working.
Great points already made. I think in the future we'll get an easel and to scribe also these sort of additional questions that come up, like homeowners associations. And I'm gonna hope everyone just stays open-minded in pro, con, best, worst, what's working, what's not, and we'll just gather all this information and sort of see where we're coming from. But let's go to you next, Dave.
Hi, I'm Dave Thaler. I'm a professional engineer. I'm a licensed surveyor. I'm a real estate broker. And for some reason, I just got appointed to the Landscape Architecture Board, about which I know absolutely nothing. So it's my pleasure to be here. I represent the Maryland Building Industry Association, which is the newish name for the old Home Builders of Maryland. And it represents something on the order of 1,200 firms throughout Maryland that do housing of one variety or another. And I'm sure I don't have to tell this group there really is a housing crisis. I mean, it's worst on the West Coast, but yesterday's Wall Street Journal had new housing starts down 18%. Now in Maryland, in the Baltimore metropolitan area, typically there's about 14,000 permits a year. Last year, it was down to about 10,000 permits. I have a little quiz for everybody. Guess how many permits Baltimore County did in 2022? And I'm going to give you a hint. Baltimore County's 10-year average is 1,100 permits a year. And Prince George's County, which is just a little bit bigger than Baltimore County, did 4,900 permits in 2022. Guess how many permits Baltimore County did in 2022? 336. There is a housing crisis, especially in affordable housing, but in all housing. And homeowners associations, local community opposition, I mean, we're all familiar with it. And really, at least in my view, one of the principal obstacles is Euclidean zoning. And I'm sure this group sort of knows that zoning started in 1916 in New York City with the construction of the Equitable Building, which was 1 million square feet in lower Manhattan. And zoning is supposed to prohibit overcrowding of the land. And that appears in almost all the zoning ordinances, certainly Baltimore County and Howard County. Preventing overcrowding of the land is another way to say promoting sprawl. And that's what we have. Something like 85 or 90% of the country that is zoned for single family housing. And it prohibits junior living over the garage, in-law apartments when mom is too old to take care of herself. And it's my view and the view of the association that anything that will help increase a zoning, given the crisis that we face, is something that we ought to be supporting. And ADUs are probably the way to do it. They're gentle zoning. It's not rezoning the whole neighborhood for high density. And it is my hope that we will be able to present something to the legislature that will help encourage that. Thank you for the opportunity, Madam Secretary.
Thank you for all the data. I appreciate that. We'll be
Well,
tapping
I
you for
should
more
add-
data.
I should add that the MBIA now has a member, Zonda, and which is an analytic firm all over the country, really, and we may be able to help provide data to the group.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Theo Williams with the Department of Housing and Community Development. I'm serving as the Secretary's designee. I'm a special assistant in the Office of the Secretary in the Division of Policy. I think Mr. Thaler really took the words out of my mouth. We also view that we are currently in a housing crisis, particularly in an affordable housing crisis. We have about 120,000 missing units in this state. I don't remember the exact breakdown of affordable housing, but a majority of those are in the area of affordable housing. We are particularly crunched within the areas of 60% AMI and less, and particularly 30% AMI and less, and that's area median income. So it's really those at the very lowest ends of the affordable housing spectrum that are facing the greatest challenges right now. Because of that, we do view ADUs, granny flats, in-law suites as a way that we can sort of address that crisis. The department has only limited funds. We are the largest financier of affordable housing in the state, and the low-income housing tax credits is the greatest tool that we have across the country. But those resources only go so far. So if there are ways that we can allow the market to address these imbalances and inequities in a natural way, we want to be supportive of those activities. I do come from a rural community as well, so we certainly understand the challenges that many communities face and the barriers that they have associated with allowing these type of units. So we're very excited to be part of this conversation to see what solutions work, not just only to address the affordable housing crisis, but also to allay community concerns and really come to a solution that works for everyone. Thank you.
I'm already getting out
Yeah.
of control here.
We work all over the state, and I don't have to tell everybody what the obstacles and the barriers are, but the easiest place to work that we have ever found is the town of Salisbury, okay, where your secretary, Day was until recently the mayor, and we are very hopeful, given your secretary and what he's done in Salisbury, that you'll do the same for the state.
Thank you. I'm gonna come back to me at the end and we'll just keep it moving all the way around.
Good morning. I'm Dan Hupp. I'm on Westminster, Maryland, City Council. I've only been in office for about 2.5 years, but I have a lot of familiarity with planning and zoning issues. I served on the City of Westminster's Board of Zoning Appeals for probably close to 10 years, part of that as an alternate member. And then I was also on the Carroll County Planning and Zoning Commission for 8 years. I also have a background in real estate. I've done development, mostly residential development, also manage a lot of investment properties, commercial as well as residential. I have been talking, going back to Carroll County Planning and Zoning days, which I was appointed in 2012, the issue with housing, because building never really recovered from the Great Recession. Additionally, the type of housing that's being, if you want to go out and buy a McMansion, you can find a McMansion. But the diversity of housing, the smaller houses, the ADUs, the apartments, there is not a lot of will out there for it. It's been building, but two of the largest issues, and I know this from my own personal experience on Carroll County Planning and Zoning, is a lot of NIMBYism. We don't want those smaller houses there. You're gonna drive down my value. And then also, quite frankly, being an elected official myself, I feel very comfortable saying this, a lack of political will. Okay. People do not have the guts to take on the issue and do something about it. Now, don't get me wrong, there are some people that are willing to do that, but a lot of times the elected officials, once you get a community group kind of getting up in arms, even though it's the right thing to do from a long-term perspective, they wimp out. So, I look forward to this discussion. I was also on the 10-year housing assessment, which was back right before the pandemic. These issues have been coming for a long while. And what I hope to see is that we not only talk about it, come up with really good ideas to address it, but that we do something about it. Because this crisis has been building and it's been coming. So we can't just talk about it. We have to actually implement and do something about it, in my humble opinion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for your perspective.
I'm Tiffany Harris, broker owner of Harris Hawkins & Co., and I'm representing Maryland Association of Realtors. I have a background in affordable housing. For close to 5 years, I worked for Howard County Housing Commission, managing close to 5,000 affordable units in the county. In addition, I've served locally and at the state level on our affordability committees. So I am excited to be a part of the solution to the housing crisis. I won't be repetitive. I think we all acknowledge that we do have a housing crisis, but I'm excited to be here.
Thank you so much. My name is Jennifer Ray, and I work professionally as a transportation planner and leading a section on transportation planning I've worked in this industry for 24 years. One of the things that has been wonderful to see as time has continued is finally the professional acknowledgement that we need to build more equity and inclusiveness as not just something that we've been doing, but it's recognized across all industries. I have a background with a degree in engineering, a certification in planning, and have done many policy reviews and understanding of how we truly need to connect people to places. And it's not just people who have the ability to make those connections, but ensuring that we have that open for everybody, that we have not only locations where people can live with everybody, but also how we connect them everywhere and how we connect to these communities that we need within, as we've all acknowledged, this housing crisis. So I'm happy to be here.
Thank you, Jennifer. Deborah.
Hi, I'm Deborah Bilo. I'm here on behalf of the American Institute of Architects. I'm a board member of the Maryland chapter, board member of my local Potomac Valley chapter, and I live in Prince George's County. I also run a small residential architecture practice called Cedar Architects, and sort of with that, I have plenty of personal experience to bring to the table. I have two I have two people who have recently reached out to me in the past couple of months looking for solutions like this for their own houses. One has a daughter who graduated from college and her daughter can't afford a place to live and wanted to not live in her mom's home. So I was looking for a solution, and I think her mom didn't want her to live in her home either. And another woman who is a neighbor has a husband who is at the beginning stages of dementia and is in need of at-home care, and they don't want to have to leave their home. So just two sort of anecdotal examples, but we are at the forefront as architects of some of the first people that are approached about these issues. We spend our days thinking about housing and how people live, and I'm really grateful to be able to be a part of this discussion with all of you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Mandy Gitt. I'm a certified interior designer in the state of Maryland. I have a business partner and we are a small business, Simply Bespoke Studio. I'm also a member of the Maryland Coalition of Interior Designers, and I'm currently the co-chair of legislation. I can speak to, as an interior designer, how important it is to make accommodations and accessibilities for people in their homes. One of our very first clients didn't want to leave their community. They wanted to age in place. So we're very passionate about helping people not only live in their homes as long as possible, but also making sure we're adhering to code and ordinances.
Hi, Izzy Scheikoff. I'm the Director of Housing Services at the Department of Aging. I'm here on behalf of Secretary Roque, relatively new to the department. One of the things that Secretary Roque has been doing is a lot of meetings and outreach with the community with communities around the state, the area agencies on aging in particular. Affordable housing, I agree, is very much in crisis. And we are here because we want to support any policies and practices that will promote and increase access to affordable housing for seniors.
Great. Thank you, Izzy. And I heard you introduce yourself as Izzy, so that's okay. Wonderful. Thank you. I think I'm on, so I'll go ahead and circle back to me then. Wow, what a great group, really. And I hope that the folks virtual will be able to join us in person at a future meeting so we can hear more about you, and we'll make sure you can all weigh in. So why am I here? The part of the legislation requires that the governor appoint a chair. And so Secretary of Planning is your chair. I will utilize my AICP planning skills to be your facilitator, essentially. As much as I will have opinions and resources and information, my job will be to be objective and to ensure that all perspectives and everything is being brought forth and everybody's voice is being heard in this process, and then ensuring that as our team on the staff, really across MDP, who's the primary staff, but also DHCD, who's very involved with their staff. And then additionally, we did reach out, kind of a mutual reaching out between the Department of Aging, Department of Disabilities, feeling that their involvement would really add value to this conversation. I don't expect us ever getting to a vote, so to speak. I usually work by, if not consensus, by consent. And consent is, I can live with that when we kind of move through our process. And so Lisa and Izzy are really here to engage, but if we ever have to get to a final kind of conclusion, they're not a formal member of the task force. I just want to make that clear up front. In terms of my background, interestingly, I heard that we have the rural and the urban. I've lived, worked, and experienced that whole transect of across the way in terms of rural. I live on the Eastern Shore right now in Chestertown, but lived and worked many years in Pittsburgh. So I've seen the vast array of, yes, this is not a one size fits all. There's a lot of different things to consider in varying levels of population density type locales and whatnot. And so I hope I can help keep that balance that we need to keep in this conversation through having been, living, experiencing all of those areas. I think the other thing I want to share is that I've also worked as a developer, ran nonprofits, as a consultant, and now in government. And so one of the aspects of why I think I became the Secretary of Planning is most of my experience is actually not in a traditional planning office, but more so in the field, in the trenches, doing projects, working in nonprofits and across the spectrum, small and large. So what I feel is most important is perspective. And I hope we can gain all of that. My final story is we all have our COVID stories. So mine was, I had 3 generations all of a sudden wind up in my little tiny cottage style home. 2 very active grandsons at 2 and 4, my 2 grown daughters and myself, all in my home during COVID. It was what we all did. Many of us did that. What a nice little place. Been nice for at least those little boys. I almost built something. But we as communities and as families and as people and as part of a community, we adapt and we learn. What do we need for the point in time? And I hope that through this conversation, we'll all learn. We'll all find something new that we didn't maybe know before and offer. All of that. And that's going to be my job, is to ensure that we do that, but stay on time. And so if you don't feel like your voice quite got heard, I'm just going to, further to encourage you to be in touch with us. If you're part of the general public out there, use that Google form, comment form. We will pick those up. We will pull them together and make sure that they're available to everyone. And if you're a member of the task force, reach out to us. I would love, for my sake and my inbox, for you to reach out to Joe and he will help ensure, but please also feel free, of course, to reach out to me directly. And so I think that's just a little bit of what we wanted to go over in the beginning. Oh, we have one more thing business item we do have to take care of. And I am actually going to turn to Joe to help me out with this one, because this just popped into our inbox about a day ago, and that is from the State Ethics Commission. Would you like to share what we need to do on that? Because I'm learning this also.
Sure. So this, and this is not, I'm not an expert on this, but is determined that this task force is formerly part of the executive unit, and the members are public officials subject to the public ethics law. So essentially that means you have to complete a financial disclosure. I'll send a follow-up email about that. I'm not sure what the due date is for that. I know I'm on the Commission for Environmental Justice and Sustainable Communities. I have to do one every year. They're pretty, I would say, yes.
Like, what? I came on as secretary, just go online, fill it out. You do not have to give them every detail of your life. It's kind of required if you're in any kind of public service.
Yeah, so I'll follow up in the next couple days with more information about that. They'll probably be letting me know if people are lagging and completing it. If again, I don't know when the due date is. I need to double check that, but I'll follow up with you if I need you to complete it. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
I can do that.
We will definitely do that. And if anyone has any concerns about that, let us know. The other thing I would like to do, and this will be voluntary, it'd be nice to just have a little short bio on everyone so we can continue to get to know everybody and those resources that we do have involved. So I think with everyone's help, we can do both actually. So we can also be reaching out to each other, which I really encourage. If you hear something you'd like to know more, reach out to each other. So I think that gives us a pretty good sense of who we're here. Now let's figure out why we're here. So hopefully when you all agreed to be part of this task force, you had a pretty good idea of that, but let's go over it to make sure we're all starting out on the same page. I think as we've heard, and I am a member of AARP, and I have read your newsletter, and I have gone online, wonderful resources. But we are seeing now what's called ADUs, it has a name of something that was informal for a lot of years, in the news tremendously, a lot. We've, put up a few, you all have this presentation, so you can look at the details and click on the articles also. Yeah. Oh, I don't know how much variation we have, but we'll work on that. I agree. That's really rough, isn't it? I've got some things in front of me, but you're right. So this is not our normal room, so we'll figure that out. We'll work on it. Thank you. And so I would encourage you all, we have a lot of those articles. I'm sure you've seen them, but let's create a repository. That'll be part of our research to just do links. And we'll be in touch with sort of maybe easy ways to do that. So it's not just a whole ton of emails going around. But we will look for any of those types of links so we can all learn the good, bad, and the ugly. I mean, there's all kinds, right? And so let's look for those articles. Here's a few. We have a lot more in the research we've already done. Going to the next, so that's a little bit wide. So the Senate Bill 382. Interestingly, as it moved through and toward the end, it was very specific about staying neutral, that this wasn't about promoting and taking a position. It was really about study, research, make recommendations, understand all of the variety of issues that folks struggle with around this particular, any type of housing, right? I think in a lot of different ways. And so I think that's a very important part of this that we need to keep in mind as we look at this. And if you haven't had a chance to read the bill, it's pretty easy. Maryland Senate Bill 382. If it wasn't in your materials, just Google it. But the specifics are essentially really related to, and Susan, can you advance that slide for me, please? So we all have it there. I have not memorized this. I think the first aspect of this is common language. Making sure we're all using the same language when we talk about what is an accessory dwelling unit. Obviously, some of us who are planners, there are definitions in zoning codes, and that may not always be exactly the same in every zoning code. So we do have to really keep that in mind. But it's a secondary dwelling unit on the same lot, parcel, or tract as a primary dwelling unit that's constructed. So there's a primary, and this is secondary. Okay. Don't put us to sleep. Thank you. Another key word. So you see the word, we're gonna circle back to some of these words in bold, but the notion of conversion. What does that really mean? We have some great experts around the table that I'm sure have perspectives on that. So we have the conversion word that's bolded there. Attached to or through full or partial conversion. And the other aspect as a new building detached from a primary dwelling unit. What does a dwelling unit mean? single unit provides independent living facilities for at least one person. So this may seem straightforward, but as we get into this, those details may end up may matter. So we'll want to make sure that we're being consistent within our group and how we come out with our final report also. Next slide. And were we unable to do a partial dim, or is it just all or nothing? Uh-huh. Oh, okay. Okay. Sorry. Is it mostly, oh, thank you. See, we're already becoming a community. We're sharing resources. Lovely. Love it. Okay, so the tasks are very specific in the bill. Survey and document representative sample of state and local codes, laws, ordinances, policies regarding ADUs in areas zoned. It specifically says for single family residential use, which was interesting. I have some prerogatives as chair. That doesn't mean we have to have a blinder of other information that may be useful and may contribute to this. I think it's just, this is what the bill is asking us to do. That doesn't mean we're going to ignore things that might add information and value, but it's where we will focus certainly our study and our interest. Study available best practices for streamlining, standardizing the application process for permits. You know, there are folks, and we've already begun to look around the country at different states that are handling this in a variety of different ways. And why not learn from others who have already been doing some of this? Is there something that we can learn from that? And then ultimately make legislative or other policy recommendations, including a list of best practices for local governments that holistically address practical issues associated with the development of ADUs on owner occupied, very clear about that, bold also, land zone for single family residential use. And item B, impacts on local housing markets, neighborhood livability, and other policies and projects related to ADUs. Let me be very clear, because I know this is a topic near and dear in the state of Maryland. We are not, as a group, tasked with reaching in and changing local zoning. That is something local zoning will determine one way or the other. We can help inform that. We can help and really look at state policy and how that can, maybe through how we work with our financing agencies and other aspects, we can do those types of things, or it may inform those things. But we are not here to reach in and tell locals what their zoning should be. And I think we have to be, because I know that makes people nervous. And so we have to be very clear that our recommendations are going back to the General Assembly and to the governor in that regard. So I just want to, allay concerns and also be very clear about what we can and can't do. So those are our specific tasks as it relates to the bill. Any questions about the bill? Well, let me just cover the due dates. So on November 1st, we simply have to report on activities. We're up and running. Here's our process, who's involved, where we're going, how's the web page has been set up. That one will be pretty straightforward. I think we're well underway to meeting that report deadline on November 1st. You obviously all will see that report and make sure that you concur with how that's been pulled together. Our big deadline is the June 1st deadline. So not a ton of time, but in some respects, that's the great thing about being on a task force. You're not committing the rest of your life, right? There is an end date. We can get through this, through our monthly meetings and actually come up with what I hope will be something we can all be proud of in terms of the work, and that it can be picked up and perhaps used by others, however they may want, beyond our deliverable to Governor Moore and the General Assembly. So that's our target. And that's what our process is focused on doing. And so I think with that one, I'm going to get into the timeline and the process next, but any questions about the bill and what we're tasked with doing? Yes. Mm-hmm. There are limitations as to what the state can reach in and do in terms of a local municipal zoning code. I am going to let Joe pick up on that so that I don't misstate anything. He has a lot more experience in Maryland zoning than I have.
And I want to clarify, I'm not a lawyer either. So, I'll base it on my own experience. So you asked the question if they allow ADUs. So ADUs are allowed, they are permitted. So it's that the ability to add ADUs to your ordinances are completely allowed. As constructed right now, and we're going to talk about land use authority at the state and local level here in a second. The state cannot require it or cannot have influence on how an ADU is signed, at least under current statute. And traditionally,
Yes, please weigh in.
So generally, having been in the planning and zoning world of being a local official, I think there's two different comments I would make. Is local zoning is local zoning. So the state can do things to encourage, to control, but at the end of the day, local zoning is local zoning. And I would suggest to you, and I'm a big advocate for affordable housing and all that, but I would object strongly if the state was interfering in my local zoning code, in our local zoning code, because the reality is each community is unique unto itself. So the challenges that I might have in Westminster might be very different than the challenges in Annapolis, or the challenges in Carroll County are very different than the challenges in Howard County. So when you start trying to create a one size fits all, sorry, I have hearing aids and I cannot turn off this ringer. So when you try to create well, then my hearing aids don't work, but anyway. So anyway, then I can't turn them up and down. But I think you would run if we as a task force were trying to, number one, that's not clearly what they want us to do. No. But also if we were as a task force doing that, I think that would be highly problematic because you're just going to run into your trouble.
Yeah, sure. Right. And I would love to have Amy weigh in on this also, if we can move around as a local planning person in that role.
So a common mantra that we often say in local planning is we can be more restrictive than the state. We can't be less restrictive than the state.
Thank you for simplifying that so nicely, Amy. That's great. And so, but it's why I wanted to bring this up. I wanted to make sure everyone was clear. This will not result in us going in and mandating that all municipalities, all areas adopt this. But we do feel that the information could be used in a lot of other different ways. So let's go into our timeline and process just to, once again, give you some of this added orientation of what we're doing. What we have mapped out, we do have monthly meetings, and we will be doing some form of a doodle poll so that we can get as much as close as possible to everybody being available for these meetings. We feel that by offering the hybrid option, we would really love and encourage, as you can tell, it's just so much better when we can be together to be in person. But if you don't want to lose track of what's happening and you're traveling that week, you can tune in. So we'll do that. We will also set the meetings for the rest of the time frame. And so that all the way through June, so that you'll know what to count on in terms of this. I know I need that in terms of my calendar, and I'm sure you all have, just a busy life. And so we will be doing that over the next few weeks and trying to get that sorted out and into everybody's calendar, certainly before the October meeting, because we'll have an October meeting. And so that's definitely on our mind. And in October, we basically, I think, oh, I think on the next slide, Joe. So that's, yeah. So this sort of breaks down the overall plot process a little bit more with that at a glance kind of thing. We've already been working. So this bill obviously was passed back in April. So our team has already been working in terms of doing research and pulling the plan together, getting the task force appointed. We had to go through the Office of Appointments to get you all appointed. And that all took time. So here we are in September already. This meeting, as we mentioned earlier, is just about the background, getting to know each other, why we're here. October, we're going to start digging down. So we will start rolling up our sleeves a little bit more in terms of sort of really understanding the existing. We've done a survey that we'll share with you in a little bit about what we've learned in terms of where this does exist across the state and what we're learning. We can share a little bit with you today on that, and it's coming to closure. So we'll have more of a report out on that, understanding of the best practices in more detail. And we'll be looking to you all after this meeting that if you have examples or things that we need to be made aware of, please help us with that process so that we can be thorough as possible. November, we're going to be looking at the impacts. There's this notion of, okay, measuring impacts. It's part of the bill language you saw on local housing markets and neighborhood livability. We weren't funded for a full-blown consultant study of any part. So we're going to do our best on this, and some of it may be more qualitative, but if it's robust, we feel like that can still tell us a lot of what we need to know around what is that notion of measuring impacts. And we'll be digging into that in November. And then in December, we may engage things like focus groups, interviews, get more specifics, details, make sure we've looked at everything. There is no doubt that the broader issue of housing is going to come up. We will do what I like to call put it in the bike rack, the parking lot, put it on the bike rack and making sure that we are documenting those things that may be of use, not only to DHCD specifically or aging or disabilities, but I also happen to chair the Smart Growth Subcabinet. And that subcabinet is a cross section of multiple, I think there's 13 to 15 secretaries on that subcabinet. We are not required to take this to that subcabinet. However, I will be taking this to that subcabinet so that the subcabinet as a group of secretaries can take a lot of this information and perhaps use it within our agencies. And so that's part of where we'll be there. I think it's our intent by after the first of the year to get down into some serious framing and defining of the report and really starting to pull it together, see what it looks like, what do we have, where are the gaps, so that we have ample time for review, filling in the gaps, making sure everyone's had a chance to input, including the public, and then being able to meet our deadline of June 1st. So that's the overall game plan. Questions on that? Seem reasonable? Everybody in? Nobody's running for the door. Okay, we are good. ADU impacts on housing markets and neighborhood livability. This was the thing I just mentioned before in terms of, well, what does that really mean? How do we measure that? What are the metrics? What are the criteria for that? I think that's something that we will help define our criteria here and determine what is it parking? There's a whole array of issues we know. We've seen them all or we wouldn't be around this table. So we'll dig down into that. But I think that's the main thing is we really want to at least consider what that means. The other aspect of that, just double checking my notes, make sure I don't forget something here. I think on this one, I mean, Joe, is there anything else that at this stage that we want to really focus on these impacts in terms of what you're going to need with your staff team that you're working with from this group?
Yeah, we've been discussing this for quite a while because this is something that we noticed very early on in the legislation that, we didn't know how this was going to be done, especially with no funding, as was mentioned. We've been talking with Theo and DHCD's team. We've also been talking with folks at the National Center for Smart Growth, who I believe are on here. While we don't have anything defined, I mean, what we've come to realize is that without the actual permitting data, it'd be very hard to do a true quantitative analysis of the impacts on local housing markets. And in the amount of time that we have allocated to this before our report is due, we don't think that accessing that permitting data is realistic. We've even talked with a couple local planning directors about this. While you'll see later that there are a lot of AD ordinances that are already active in Maryland, the permitting data, and I yield to other local planners around here, might not be that accessible. So we're thinking about, but we like your feedback if you'd have some, and also would appreciate your help. We're thinking about a more qualitative approach to this, using literature review, focus groups, interviews, maybe developing a few case studies with jurisdictions that have a little bit better data or have been developing ADUs for a longer period of time, because the legislation does use the word representative sampling. So those are the approaches we're considering taking. I know DHC's been talking about updating the 10-year needs assessment, which was mentioned by Councilman Hoff, and I'll be having a few slides later about that. So those are the approaches we're thinking of taking. And when you saw like focus groups and interviews as we get into later this year and into next, that's where we really think we can hit this component. But also, we're really going to spend a lot of time in November focusing. It's probably one of the main topics of conversation in the November meeting. We'll bring even more options, what we do have available to that meeting, and really figuring out the best approach. But I'd be happy to hear if any others have feedback on this. It also uses the word, the term neighborhood livability. So, that's why we had a lot of bolded words in here, because while the legislation does define some things and state things, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily clear, and we could all have different interpretations of what those things mean.
Any thoughts, questions before we move into background and research? And have we had any comments from the task force members virtually? I want to make sure we check in on that too.
Yes, I have a question. I know that we're scheduling for October 17th, but I'm not sure about the rest of the group, but the MML Fall Conference is on October 17th. Just wanted to give it a heads up about that.
Yes, so we're not going to do the October 17th is not going to be the meeting. Yeah, well, that was my fault. I was just trying to get some things on the calendar. I did send it out as a tentative, but then a number of people told me that was a conflict, wasn't going to work for them. So we will be sending out a Google form similar to a doodle poll soon this week to try to reschedule October meetings, November meetings, and December meetings, none of which have been finalized. I realized this morning that I did not update that portion of the agenda at the end. So I think the agenda does say November 28th in December or some other date, but those are not finalized. So we will be contacting you, a colleague, Yasmin Baram in the back, will be contacting you all to schedule the next meetings.
Thanks. I'm glad someone brought that to our attention. Amy.
I mean, we could schedule a meeting there, we'll all be there.
That's a great thought. We will certainly look at that, but I think not everyone will, it may not work for everybody. This is going to be complicated no matter how we look at it. And I want to get a sense of where the best central location is so we can maximize in person, depending on where people are coming from. So we're going to really jump on this right away this week and try to figure out what's going to work best for everybody. But I appreciate that thought. Maybe in the spring, we could do a report out. So, Amy.
I was just going to address some quantitative data channels. And I know that through our annual reports that we submit to the Department of Planning, most jurisdictions do report out on housing by type. I know that in Queen Anne's County, we do that. So there might be some, at least anecdotal information, but I just wanted to add that in Queen Anne's County, we've faced a very interesting challenge in that our growth area is supported by a wastewater treatment plant, which has reached its nutrient load limit. So we have been keeping very close track of our dwelling unit numbers, at least on the county level. I can't say the same for the way we're tracking information in our municipalities, but I would volunteer to offer some of that data for some anecdotal information, because we have been very closely tracking, and we track by single family, and we do have a lot of apartment developments, and accessory dwelling units are permitted uses, and we do track that as well. So, but other jurisdictions may be in a similar boat, and I was just bringing that up because of the connection, when applicable in growth areas, to wastewater treatment facilities. That is a means that we might be able to access data. I'm sure you thought of it already.
Don't
I just thought
assume,
I'd put it out
don't
there.
assume. All ideas are good ideas, so thank you. Great. Well, let's go ahead and move into background and research. And actually, Joe, I'm going to ask you to take the lead and pull in anyone from your team that you would like on the rest of these. And I really want to approach, we're doing well on time. So I want to approach this next segment around the background and research as something that you should feel free to ask questions along the way and ensure that we contribute, add to what we've already started to pull together, and use this as an opportunity to learn and discuss in this next primary segment of our day, because we're moving so well. So go ahead, Joe, take us through what you all have learned through your research.
This was already discussed about zoning authority, so I'm not going to dwell on this. But if you're interested in digging into the statutory requirements, there's a few on the screen. There's other ones as well. It's important to note that municipalities and non-charter counties are distinguished in the land use article from charter counties. So that can get confusing, and you're gonna have to look in different locations for the requirements, but a lot of them mirror each other. Not exactly, but a lot of them are similar language. So land use article 303 addresses municipality and non-charter counties, and it specifically talks about these kinds of jurisdictions are required to implement their comprehensive plan through their zoning ordinances and other land use regulations. Land use article 1417 says the same for charter and code counties. And then land use article 1-302, in addition to 303 and 304 after that, describe what consistency means. These are just, if you're familiar with priority funding areas, those are different inside and outside of priority funding areas. But essentially, these, in addition to other statutory references, are going to really describe that how the majority of zoning authority has been delegated to municipalities and counties in Maryland. And it has traditionally has been for a long time. So.
You do not need to be an attorney to be on this task force. If you have questions on how this relates and ultimately in our report, let us know. I mean, I think we just need to be aware right now of the complexity.
Or make sure, Councilman Hoff, make sure you use a microphone. I'm sorry, I got this one right now. So you just have to push.
Are these working, these other ones?
As long as the green light turns on, that means the battery's working and it's going through the mixer.
Okay. Should be good.
I was going to just say, when we were talking about who controls zoning and all that, the state does have influence, because priority funding areas are a great example of that. So there are things that the state can do to encourage counties or municipalities to do certain things with their zoning code. And should they not do that and not be in compliance or meet certain numbers, that could impact what kind of funding you can get. So I just want to be clear for the people that aren't really kind of familiar with how some of that works. You know, it's not like, even though zoning is local, there is influence that the state has that it can, as I said before, cajole you know, counties or municipalities to look at things a certain way.
That's well put. And you know, while we say I just want to make sure everybody understands this. That doesn't mean we're like shutting a door here, like, oh well, why are we here, right? Zoning is controlled locally. We're going to be looking at local ordinances. We're going to be looking at legislation from other states on this topic, and their incentives, other things like or certain kinds of controls, such as priority funding areas. I mean, it's not completely unheard of in Maryland with critical. Those of you familiar with critical areas, that is an area where the state does have some influence over local zoning.
The other thing I was going to say is the importance of like a task force like this is being able to make recommendations, because if I'm on a local planning board or on staff even, and I'm looking at implementing something, instead of having to go out there in the world and just kind of look all the way around, if I have something from the state or from some other good group that kind of points out the different issues that I need to consider when I'm creating my own code, that kind of work is very important and very helpful, and would encourage more municipalities or more counties to maybe look at updating their ADU ordinance or create one if they don't have one.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to see that when the preliminary survey we sent out to our planning contacts over the summer. There's a lot of interest in best practices, model ordinances. So there's a hunger out there for this, at least to some extent, and that desire for that education, because a lot, as was very well put throughout our introductions, there's definitely, it's well understood there's a housing crisis, particularly affordable housing crisis in Maryland, and a lot of people want to address it at all different levels.
Well, and I want to just add, speaking of the Secretary of Planning, not as your chair at the moment, where we go as the state, agency is one of trying to be a leader, to be able to provide a menu of possibilities for local jurisdictions. So we will certainly, as the Department of Planning, take what comes out of this and try to lead the way by providing model ordinances and, menus of possibilities and things, so that we can make it easier for folks to put their toe in, whether it be this topic or other topics that we know are challenging across our state. So that is certainly my intent as Secretary of Planning, to be able to do that.
Thank you in advance. Okay, we're revisiting some of those bolded words we showed you earlier. This is, we want to leave room for discussion, but we've been looking at this since the spring when this was passed. And these are our internal discussions and what we've established as these definitions. So there's that area zone for single family use. Right. And when we've already been looking at local ordinances, and ADUs or something like ADUs are in all sorts of different zoning, or permitted in all sorts of different zoning districts in Maryland counties and municipalities, some by right, some by special exception or condition. But since we're following, the charge of the legislation itself, we are defining this as areas or zoning districts in which single family uses predominate or are intended to predominate. Because oftentimes single family uses will be allowed in commercial zones or other districts. And our interpretation of what the bill is charging us with is these are the areas we should be focusing on. Okay, it does say owner occupied, right? So ADUs are units subordinate to the primary structure or unit on a property. The owner of the property must live in one of the two units. That's what we're defining what owner occupied says in the bill. But we will see when we look again at local ordinances and other state legislation that there have been a lot of close analysis of this owner occupied requirement. And it's something that we would like the task force to consider in its deliberations. But as these are how we're defining what is stated in the bill. And then conversions mentioned multiple times in that definition of ADUs, turning a portion of a primary structure or unit or or a portion of an already existing subordinate structure, such as a garage, something like that, into an ADU. Right, because there's all sorts of different ADUs, internal, external, existing structure again, or something developed new, tiny homes. I know we had a slide of a tiny home earlier. There's some comments on that. I know Theo Williams' colleague Justin Fair at DHCD is my resident expert that I go to when I need to find about tiny homes. I think he's listening right now. He can feel free to chime in the chat if he would like to. But there's lots of different ways to approach this issue, but that's how we're defining conversions in the bill. And while the bill doesn't really say this, we're taking this approach. We're going to focus on ADUs for rent, and that's the majority of what we've seen in the examples in the ordinances. We really want to focus on that ADUs for rent, and especially on the next slide, if you can switch to, we're going to talk about the needs assessment. Councilman Hoff mentioned it earlier. He was on the advisory group, as was I and a couple of my colleagues when we were developing this in late 2019 into 2020, right before the pandemic, and then continued into the pandemic. It was published by DHCD in December 2020. And Theo, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think of this, while there's a lot of different housing plans, programmatic housing plans, and others at the state level, regional level. I consider this kind of the high level approach that the state wants to take, its strategy for meeting the needs of all Marylanders at affordability, different types of housing, and it deals with both renters and homeowners. So I really think of this as the high level plan that is the state's plan for addressing that need. And you can see it right there in its purpose: chart a course for Maryland to become a more affordable place to live by 2030. I'm not going to read all of this to you, but you do have the visions as well. The vision here as well. It definitely talks about rental and for sale home ownership. If you haven't reviewed this plan, seen this plan, I recommend it. I think it's an excellent document. It breaks it down by region, and it does do some quantitative analysis. They create stability indices for homeowners and renters by census tract. And this was done in partnership with the National Center for Smart Growth. And as I mentioned, DHCD is in the process of developing a work plan and approach for updating this, because it uses American Community Survey 5-year data. I know it ends at 2017. What is that, 2014 to 17, 2013 to 17? I don't know. So the data is a little bit older. I think a lot of the trends would be the same. But you know, we're here now, we're up to 2021 in the 5-year ACS data. You can switch. All right, so they're the guiding principles on the left from the needs assessment. It clearly documents the need for more affordable renting housing in Maryland. If you're to read this document, one of the main things you'll get out of it, that I've gotten out of it, is how housing burdened our renters are, particularly at lower incomes. And you can see that this is just a supply of, I know you can't probably read the numbers are pretty small for you there, but it isn't, I did send this to you. And you can see that the supply there is just, particularly at the lower income level renters, is just not meeting the demand. And I know I said that the data is a little bit older on this, but I doubt that's changed. And I doubt any of you would say that's changed either.
Joe, I would argue that that data is probably much worse than what it was there, because having 29 dwelling units, which I manage myself, rents, you know, for a long time were relatively stable. But after the pandemic, rents increased dramatically. Now that's starting to slow, but that data is probably, if we had a snapshot of what today was, it's worse. I would just be willing to bet on that.
I would tend to agree with you there. And that's why we're updating it, right? And thank you for using the microphone. Friendly reminder, everybody else, if you would like to speak, make sure you turn on the microphone in front of you.
Speaking of which, anyone else want to weigh in?
Yes,
Please
absolutely.
always feel free. Okay. If there's something that we should add to, or what, any of this.
So then at the bottom here in red, 50% of Marylanders are cost burdened. Right, so that's 30% or more of your household income on housing. That's what this needs assessment found, and that's consistent across all jurisdictions. You know, the Maryland Department of Planning developed a housing element models and guidelines in response to recent legislation in 2019 to add a housing element requirement to comprehensive plans. And then it was recently updated in 2021 to include a fair housing requirement to comprehensive plans. And you know, we've looked a lot at this data, particularly at individual jurisdictional level, helping them with their housing elements, also reviewing draft housing elements that we received. And this is consistent across all jurisdictions. Maryland, that renters are just highly cost burdened. And then households of color, those with seniors and those making less than 80% AMI are even more overrepresented. So that gets to that fair housing issue. All right, and the need to focus on this is an equity issue. And I know that's one of Governor Moore's priorities. It's one of our priorities. And I know it's DHCD's priorities. So I don't think we need to lose sight. We don't want to lose sight of those. You know, we can be here talking about AD ordinances, design, very specific things, but don't lose sight of the fact that, like, you know, renters and households of color and other those with disabilities in Maryland are those who really, you know, need the support.
So can I interject a question here? And that is, has anyone seen any data or research on the connections to the local economy? Because we all know we can't house people and we can't grow our economy. But I feel like that linkage, and I want to try to reach out to Secretary of Commerce Anderson also, but has anyone here seen any data specifically to how this connects to local economy? What do I mean in terms of sort of if we can't have adequate, what I would call mixed income housing to support workers of all kinds or communities of all kinds, how is that affecting local economies in terms of sort of people needing to go elsewhere to live, which affects our downtown, effort, whatever that may be, affects our ability to attract employers and workforce issues, caretakers. I just feel like sometimes housing gets overly isolated. And while I realize I'm going outside my boundary here as chair, but I am curious because I feel like that might be part of our challenge and our recommendations is to sort of connect those dots of, and maybe it gets back to the livable communities question really, and that sort of generic language we were given in terms of impact on communities. But has anyone come across or seen any research around that broader issue?
Can you please I'm sorry, can you use your microphone?
I'm sorry. The
Hold
button
down the
on
green button
top.
at the top.
Sorry, the technology is not fun to deal
You have to
with.
hold it down until it turns green. Yeah, I'm sorry.
There you go.
There you go.
I wonder if the city of Annapolis might have that because that was one of the reasons that they allowed ADUs because so many people working in the city cannot afford to live in the city. And I can look into that and see if we can find anything.
For it, I think it's back at that impact question of, we have a particular outcome specific to ADUs, and obviously that's just one segment of possible housing approach. But how these things connect, I think, is going to be really important as part of how we put this together. Someone else was about to weigh in, Tiffany? You got it.
From a poll that Maryland Realtors Association conducted in January of this year, there were 29% of Maryland residents are considering leaving the state.
Wow. Do we know why?
Cost of living.
Cost of living is too high. Interesting. So you'll be able to share that with us. That would be great. Thank you. Yes, go ahead, Jennifer.
So not specific to the exact, the local economy, but even speaking to the impacts, a couple of the notes I was taking here was, of course, my background being in transportation is certainly how does that affect it? And I've done studies in South Carolina as well, where it was areas that how do people, essentially workers, cleaners, maid service, those types of things specific to Hilton Head Island. How do people get there? Where are they coming from? What does that look like on the road and the infrastructure? How do we then and more specific on ADUs as we look at bringing more people into neighborhoods and living in, smaller areas? How do we then identify modeling that traffic signals? I mean, getting down to the bare basics of how do we move around? I think all of those are elements we can look to within impacts, but it does come down from the economy standpoint of this was specific to trying to toll a road on the users on the road for, maintenance and construction dollars. And it was the recognition that oftentimes people are living so far away from where they're working. And they're already putting that time, especially for individuals of, with lower income, they're typically driving further. It's impacting their, livability, and then adding any costs on top of that was just, it was a negative. So that was more the not specific data, but some of the elements that we were looking at in some of these other studies.
That's really great. And I do feel that aspect of the bill does give us the ability, even if we can't answer or we don't have the funds to do a study, it can certainly be part of a report to say, hey, we need to look at, we recommend you look at this, or whatever the case may be. So that's why I want to kind of draw this out a little bit.
Well, if I
let's do
can,
David, and then was there, I want to make sure anybody else in the queue? Yeah, okay, after David, we'll do Amy and then back.
if I can, I think you're dead on. Okay, the bill refers to impacts on housing markets, but I think the impacts it might be thinking of is there too much traffic or not enough parking? But I think you are 100% correct that it is not looked at the economic impacts. Just on the broadest brush, if Baltimore County does 1,100 permits and goes down to 300 permits, and if the average house in Baltimore County is $450,000, that's $400 million of accessible of accessible value that the county is losing year after year, plus all the fees. Anabam Basu and his outfit over at Towson is probably the one to do it. I am not aware of any economic study that has been done, but I think you're absolutely right. We ought to garner as much as we possibly can and get as far down that path as we can.
Great. Well, thank you for weighing in on that. Amy, we're in you.
And I was just going to add that, so these are all considerations that we're looking at in Queen Anne's County. We have recently taken a meeting with a company that can provide this level of analysis of obviously traffic is an enormous issue on Kent Island and the Kent Narrows. It is, reach the beach traffic, but in general, there are wider impacts. And so understanding that analysis of what is this traffic impact in our community, but also in reaching out to this company, which is called Placer AI. I don't know if any of you may have heard of it, but it is a company that does traffic analysis and it does data analysis as to who is traveling to and from your community, where are they going while they are in your community, and where are your citizens traveling. So we are looking at trying to quantify some of those challenges specific to transportation, but there are a lot of other aspects of that data that we're interested in learning about. So it's something that the county is considering. And just to add that the conversation about ADUs is essential, but I know that for us in our community and the close work that we're doing with our housing and community development department is also focused on a mix of housing types. So the ADU isn't a silver bullet, but it's a component of a larger picture, and looking at apartment development and other types of mixed use development is a huge priority. And those are the thoughts I had in mind when listening to the presentation about the data that is available. So.
Great, thank you. Thank you. And I think we're back over.
So some of this is anecdotal, but being in Westminster, Carroll County, we're about 20 minutes from the PA line. There are a lot of workers that work in Westminster that live in Pennsylvania. I have 3 long-term employees ourselves at our real estate insurance office. 2 of them live in Pennsylvania. Why? Because of the housing affordability. That was the main driver. So, and these were people that grew up in Maryland, by the way, too. So I think that kind of ties into the data that you're talking about. Because of the affordability crisis that is particularly bad in Maryland, that is driving some of our long-term citizens to move other places. So I think that's an important, and the conversation is much more than just about ADUs. You are right about that, Amy, but that's what we're here for, ADUs, but it is a much broader issue. And the other thing that I think that people fail to understand a lot of times, having my frustration on being Carroll County Planning and Zoning, as I throw them under the bus, is the desire to all these large single-family homes, okay? And the reality is it's not just about affordability. The marketplace has changed. I have a 19-year-old, 20-year-old now. he doesn't want a giant house. That's not what people are wanting the future generations. So we have an overabundance, as I referenced before, to the McMansions, but not enough of the smaller homes. You know, they can be of good quality or high quality structures, but we need that. I refer to it the diversity of housing. We need more condos. We need more townhouses. We need more smaller single family homes. Not everybody wants to live in a 4,000 square foot house on a 1 acre lot. You know, I live myself downtown. And, you know, I often joke, like, you know, typically most of the people that are contemporaries to me are living out in the suburbs in, you know, McMansion. I live downtown where smart growth exists. I live in a single family home. Next to me is another single family home, which is a rental. And next to me is a 4-unit building. You know, everybody gets along fine. You know, again, I'm kind of referring to that NIMBYism that I get so frustrated with, where people act like if the apartment building goes into the neighborhood, oh, the world's going to end. I'm like, well, the world isn't ending on my street, and I live among a diverse group of people from a socioeconomic viewpoint. And I really think we need to get back to more of that, in ADUs are one of those examples. The other point I was going to make, Joe, just real quick on ADUs, I think any ADU, whether it's for rent or not, is a good thing, because you have to think about it. If I'm building an ADU for a family member, as long as there's not restrictions on there, if that family member moves out or moves on one way or the other, I'm going to turn around potentially and rent that out. So an ADU that might not be initially for rent is going to eventually probably become a rental unit. So I think that's one point I want to make, that really, I think any ADU is from that standpoint is a good thing, because even if it's not initially for rent, it might become for rent later. So
Great.
thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Any other comments before we move further? Oh, I'm sorry. We're gonna go Tiffany, and then over to you, Dave, and then we're gonna let Joe continue.
I just wanted to add to the perspective.
Oh,
that-
and online. I want to make sure we don't forget that. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
I wanted to add to the perspective that Dan was discussing as far as Maryland residents moving to Pennsylvania. So I have 35 agents within my office. Within the past year, additionally to myself being licensed, probably another 20 of my agents had to get licensed to be able to assist their clients that could not afford to purchase in Maryland. So it is a very huge thing that's happening, even though they do still work in Maryland. After accounting for their budget, it makes more sense to purchase there, even with commuting back and forth. In addition to the 29% of Maryland residents that want to move, we also have the other issue of a lot of Maryland residents feeling that people of color don't have the same experiences in, you know, purchasing homes as well, and renting also.
Great, really appreciate that. Okay, one more comment on this one, Dave.
One last comment. Guess how many acres, undeveloped acres zoned for apartments, undeveloped acres zoned for apartments there are in Carroll County? 0. That's why we need ADUs.
Okay, thank you. for
I would
that.
like
Oh,
to
we had-
make sure.
online. What do we
yeah,
have, Susan,
I think there was, it sounded like somebody was trying to speak. We have a hand up.
from the task force? Okay. Oh, well, we can't take the public comments as having.
No, yeah, we're not public comments at the end, but if either
It's a task
Quinn,
force member, yeah.
or Mr. Griffith, Mr. Gaston, Delegate Vaughn, or Ms. Paris would like to speak, Mr. Gaston can unmute.
I'd be happy to. I wanted to jump in on this. As I listen to it, I hear all the rubbly, rosy, you know, we need ADUs, things of that nature. From my perspective as a town administrator for 2 small inner Beltway County towns recently, town of Brentwood and Village of Martin's Additions, one of the issues that we have is not only parking, but also utilizing trash and just city services as a whole. So while we're open and receptive to ADUs, one of the things that we need to, this task force needs to be cognizant of those areas that where an ADU coming in on a small piece of property is going to put a tremendous burden on the small cities and towns. So just be cognizant of that. I understand that if you live in Carroll County or Pennsylvania, those are great. But if you live in an inner county or close to a city, you're going to have a tremendous negative effect on the quality of life of the people that already live there. We have a
Thank you
huge
for that. We do want to
we have a
keep this.
huge parking issue in the town of Brentwood. And keep in mind, Brentwood is 52% Hispanic. So I'm not trying to say anything positive or negative, but a lot of Hispanic families have second and third generations of people living there, and they have 3, 4, 5 cars. They also have work trucks and things of that nature. And an ADU, as great as it is for an inner city, inner town, that has a negative effect on the quality of life of somebody who's living right next door, as a single family home and things of that nature. What you find is that a lot of people who do live in ADUs, they need cars to get to their jobs. They can't just jump on Metro or the bus or ride a bike. They need vehicles and they need work vehicles. And so that is a negative effect of the quality of life of another individual who wants to, quote unquote, stay in place.
Great, thank you. I really appreciate that we do keep this conversation balanced. We really have to be looking at all sides of this because there are challenges. And so thank you for making sure that we keep that in the discussion. Are there other online comments? I want to make sure we don't miss anyone else from the task force that's virtual. It's so hard without being.
Yes, this is Lori Paris, and I would just expand on what Mr. Gaston just said. Particularly, it's not with respect to Brentwood and his community. I'm not going to speak for that. But I think when we do look at this, there is that push, and particularly depending on where you are in the state, for transit-oriented development. And I think as we look at this, that needs to be one subset of it. I think it may, I don't want to speak for Mr. Gaston, but it may address some of the concerns that he just brought up, because usually those are the issues when you're looking at the push, and there's usually tax credits, there's usually some incentives when it comes to transit-oriented development. And I think we need to make sure that is a subset of this discussion, because I think it will bring up more issues with respect to what Mr. Gaston talked about.
Great, thank you so much for that, Lori. This is going to be tough because we're all going to want to reach, myself included, Rain and myself, reach into all these aspects of housing, and we're tasked to ADU. So I think it's great having DHCD with us because, you know, as these other broader aspects of housing come up and valuable information provided, we're going to have to, I think, figure out how to sort that and provide sort of other recommendations for your information versus our charge specific to ADU, but we're capturing it all. And I think that can go to good use. I think we had Deborah next, and then Priscilla, and then we actually will move on. One more?
Well, yeah.
Oh, well, so we haven't heard from Deborah yet.
This conversation is bringing up a lot of thoughts, I think, for all of us, but in particular, going back to the slide before where it mentioned that we're focusing on renters. And it's making me think, is that a product of, it seems obvious that it will eventually become a rental object if it isn't first for that purpose. But in thinking through the purpose of ADUs and the reason why someone might want to build one on their property, is it because of their own economic interests and trying to improve their own economic standing, because the housing market isn't giving them the opportunity to kind of have an adequate house to begin with? Are we shifting the burden on the homeowners by saying, oh, we can't give you affordable housing to begin with, so here's another option of adding an ADU that's gonna help your economic status?
Right. Really good thought on that. Okay. The previous thoughts of complexity of considering all of the challenges that we also face when those added persons units end up on the street. So I do want to go to David and sorry, Priscilla, you were next. And David. Dan Short, one last comment. And then now after the queue,
Okay.
and then we'll let Joe get back to it. Does that sound good with everybody? Okay, great.
I'm just going to make a quick comment about what you said, and I have a question. For seniors, for a lot of the elderly population, it's that their income has decreased. So when they retire and they don't have the same income and they can't afford it, they could afford it when they were fully employed, but now they can't. And that also applies to change in employment, right? So that's a consideration. But Tiffany, I just have a question about, you said people of color are not, do not have equitable treatment. Is that statewide, or is that broken down geographically?
I think more so broken down geographically.
So where are the problem areas?
If you're
This will probably be lengthy.
If you're inclined to share.
Right. We'll probably leaning more toward overall, but it's probably less rural that you see the issues, but probably still there. But well, it's all over. I'll say that. I'll leave it at that. But I can provide more.
Good.
I'll follow up with that, like more specific stats to provide that. But yeah, I just didn't want to get into a lengthy.
No, I understand. So if there is some data or anything that you could share,
yeah, definitely,
that would be.
I'll make
helpful.
note of that.
So we were going to David, Dan, and then back. Oh, you didn't. Okay, Dan, and then back.
No, I was just gonna add something related to my friend in Brentwood that was, and we do have to be sensitive to each municipality has their own issues. But I also think there's really something important to keep in mind here when we're talking about ADUs. For instance, at my house, I have an old carriage house. If I was rebuilding the carriage house and putting in an ADU, me putting in a 1-bedroom ADU, or me putting in a 2 or 3-bedroom ADU, is the intensity of that use is a lot different and the impact is a lot different. So I think that's something we need to keep in mind, because I would argue that, depending on how it's done, if I have a 1-bedroom ADU that's being occupied by one person, I don't think that is necessarily, if everybody on the street had an ADU, maybe that is necessarily going to be overburdening the system, because I could have a child tomorrow that's in the bedroom in my house, and how's that any different? So I think we need to, as we're considering these issues, think about intensity of the use is a really important thing that we need to keep in mind when we talk about ADUs.
Thank you. And actually, I think some of the data that we've been collecting on surveys and types of ordinances will really, I think, be a good next step in what we're learning, because we wouldn't be here if it wasn't complicated. And so that's why we're here, to sort through all of these different pieces of this equation, which is part of the even bigger, more complicated equation of housing in Maryland. So
the last thing I want to say, one last thing about the needs assessment before we move on. So, it was mentioned, I think Amy and others, like, the needs assessment does not say ADUs are going to solve it, right? We all know that. We're just dealing with one. It's a crisis, takes a lot of different things to deal with the crisis, right? So, it's good to focus on specific things, but I don't want you to think that the needs assessment or anybody here is saying, that ADUs are going to solve this. I do want to say that the needs assessment does not go into ADUs in detail, but it does mention them as it has a toolbox of recommended actions. I definitely recommend you look into it, a lot of different things. And ADUs are listed as a strategy specific to the actions of amending zoning to allow by right development of a diverse housing types, and offer financial incentives or financing for smaller scale infill housing products. That's where the needs assessment specifically describes ADUs as providing one strategy towards those actions. You can go to the next slide. Thank you. All right. So Maryland Department of Planning staff, my colleagues here, David Dahlstrom, Susan LaRousse, we have some excellent regional planners, have really helped compile an inventory of ADU ordinances for all Maryland jurisdictions with planning and zoning authority. If I have my count correct, it's 146 municipalities and counties. We do have the inventory complete, but I still need to do some quality control, just double checking, reviewing it, going through it all one more time. But I did the inventory, or the fields here are those that we have included in this inventory, right? So everything from the terms they use, right? That, they don't all, we've heard granny flats, accessory apartments, all these things that have been around a while. They don't all use ADUs. To the purpose of them, they're the different districts that they are permitted in, right? We talked about area zone for single family use, but that's not the only places you'll find a lot of these. If it's by right, conditional, or special exception, and then everything from design, parking, utilities, all these things we've already come up in this conversation. Actually, we don't have a field for owner occupied. It's something I wish I had thought to add at the beginning, but we've captured a lot of that information in our other field. So we'll be sending this as part of the agenda packet, the actual inventory, which is pretty extensive, in preparation for October meeting where we'll dig into more detail. But I did want to give you some themes. You can go to the next slide, Susan, and some patterns we see in it. This is probably pretty small for a lot of people to see in the room. Hopefully those joining virtually can see it well. At least I was surprised to see that 67 of those jurisdictions, at least 67 of those jurisdictions in some form permit ADUs, depending on the term they use. They all have very different restrictions, requirements, allowances, but in some form, at least 67 permit them. Most often they're permitted in the single family residential zones, your R1s, your R2s, but you also see them pretty commonly in more rural areas permitted, and in some commercial and mixed use zones. Most commonly, they are permitted only as a conditional use or special exception. Now, there is some distinctions here. In certain residential zones, they'll be allowed by right, and in other ones, they'll be by special exception. All right, but what you'll see most commonly in this inventory is the conditional use or special exception. 1 ADU per lot is the limitation in almost all of them, really. It's the vast majority is 1 ADU per lot that we're seeing. Something else I noticed is that, and this is good, we see a lot of the same language in all these ordinances. So they're obviously working with each other or working with looking at other jurisdictions' ordinances to be inspired or get information from, or maybe just, I don't know, taking from them, copying it, right? But this shows you this interest in model ordinances or examples. A frequently repeated maximum unit size is 800 square feet or no more than 50% of the size of the primary dwelling. Those numbers repeatedly come up in this inventory. Often stated design requirement is that it maintains the appearance of the single family structure. After the addition of the ADU, it must remain 1 to 2 off-street parking spaces commonly required. Most often 1, sometimes 2, regardless of the ADU. So that's pretty common. And we talked about parking here. And then owner occupancy requirements are also common, right? So owner occupied, is mentioned in the bill. It's something we're probably going to talk a lot about here. That's the most common requirement you'll see in the inventory, but there are also some familial relationship requirements. So it's not only does the owner have to live in one of the 2 units, but that the only people that can live in the ADU would be a family relationship. All right. I guess I'd like to open it up to any discussions about that before we look at other state legislation we're also looking at.
And your full summary will be at the October meeting too.
Yeah, the actual inventory
Yes, this is
itself and the full summary,
the
yes,
high
will be
level
provided. This is just to give you like a taste of what we're seeing. Correct.
October, we'll really dive into this some more when we have.
Yeah, we'll look at each field. We can
summary
look at specific jurisdictions and even more detailed trends. Yes. Okay. We'll go on to state legislation. I want to thank Theo Williams and DHCD for putting together. This is something we wanted to do, and then I think it was in July. I don't think I'd met Theo yet, and he sends me an email like, "Hey, we put together this analysis, this spreadsheet of state legislation on ADU," and I was like the skies opened up with. I was so happy, in a good way. I was so happy because I was like, wow, we've been adding to it. We've definitely added stuff to it, and we're not done. We're a little bit farther along, or farther from being completely done with this one. But I really want to thank Theo and his group at DHCD for getting this started. So we're looking at, what is that, 10? Yes. So there have been 7 that adopted. This might not be every last one, But I think it's most of them, if not all, and it's very well a good representative sampling. So Montana, Washington, Connecticut, California, New Hampshire, Oregon, and Maine have adopted state legislation related to ADUs. They all have different degrees.
Key word there, Joe, state legislation.
State legislation. This is definitely state legislation.
Okay.
And I'll talk some more about themes here in a second. And again, we'll look at it more in October. Rhode Island has passed the House, currently in the Senate committee. I don't know exactly what Rhode Island's session looks like. This is at least current as of late August. I haven't checked. And then 2 failed, Colorado and Arizona, but that legislation is still out there. We're still looking at that bill language for comparison. So some of the fields we have included, mostly thanks to Theo, included these. You know, does it address the owner occupancy requirement? Does it address short-term rentals, design restrictions, familial relationships? A lot of the same stuff you see in the fields that we analyze for the local ordinances, but this is at the state level. Does it reach down? And we've been talking about zoning authority at different levels here. Does it reach down and preempt certain aspects of local zoning requirements related to these different fields, these different considerations? Some do, some don't, some are more restrictive, some are permissive. And yeah, impact fees, what are some other big ones? You know, everything, yeah, lot and bulk requirements, setbacks. So I will continue, yeah, next slide. So to give you some themes, just like I did for the local. Many of them preempt local ordinances from requiring that owner occupancy of ADUs. And we've already brought up the owner occupancy so many times today. It's definitely a topic for this group to consider. Many also preempt that off-street parking requirement. Not all of them, many of them preempt that, saying that local jurisdictions, when they adopt ADU ordinance, they cannot require off-street parking. Lot size and other lot requirements are typically prevented from being stricter than those for the respective district or primary structure. Most of them have some flexibility regulating ADU construction or permitting due to public water or sewer access. Right? They say if it's in an area that does not have access to public water or sewer, the jurisdiction is not required to permit ADUs. So many of them have that. So, you know, we've talked about, I know Mr. Gaston discussed this there, you know, we got to keep in mind services, facilities, capacity. I know Amy mentioned it earlier about the wastewater treatment plant. So a lot of the state legislation understands that and allows for that flexibility. All to some degree require by right development of ADUs. All right, in certain characteristics, certain areas, or certain configurations. To some degree, they also all require by right development. Most permit jurisdictions to restrict or regulate ADUs as a short-term rental. Right? They'll say something like one, and you'll see this in local ordinances too, like either neither of them can be used as a short-term rental or one or the other. You can't have both the primary structure and the ADU permitted as short-term rental. And this is something that you'll see. I know I sent you all the open-ended responses. We're not really going to probably dig into those unless you have any questions today. I wanted you to see in our survey. But we have a couple questions about short-term rentals in there. I got a specific email last week, 2 weeks ago, from a planning director. Not going to give away the jurisdiction yet, asking, are you all going to be talking about short-term rentals? Right? Because, you know, the short-term rentals is a whole nother galaxy of zoning consideration, but obviously it has an impact on ADUs, and ADUs impact short-term rentals considerations. So that's something else we're looking here at the
Joe, can I just
state level.
clarify that? So what's the time frame is considered for short term, and are we really talking Airbnbs here, or what are we talking?
I mean, I'd have to look more. I can't speak for these exact. Well, I have to go back
Okay.
and look at them. But
Yeah,
yeah, we're
I
talking
think-
about Airbnbs, VRBOs,
wanna be
short-term rentals.
clear,
Yes,
that's Probably the issue, right?
that is definitely that is the issue here. The proliferation of Airbnbs. Make sure we
Well, I
please.
think to the
Mike.
extent of how, any restrictions on an ADU is in our purview, in terms of recommendations that we make, whether it be for short-term rentals or not, in terms of that.
Please make sure to use your microphones if
I
you're
just have
speaking.
a question on the
Yep.
previous page on the ADU legislation. Is that intended to be, I mean, is he saying that these are all the only states that have legislation? Because that's not correct, right? Or is he not through compiling all of that yet?
These are the ones that we found, and I can let Theo fill into, that have more recently have created ADUs legislation at the state level that impacts local zoning to help alleviate housing affordability by making ADUs more likely to, like, I'm not saying this very well, but it's state legislation to try to promote ADUs.
I just want to say that there are more, because like Texas and
Okay.
Virginia both have laws.
Okay.
And if I go through, there's probably many, many more. So
We'd love to have some more.
that's just some maybe recent states,
Mhm.
but it's much bigger than that.
Yeah, I do want to clarify this. This is not complete. You know, it's difficult. I don't know if anyone's familiar with a national inventory of states that have preempted ADUs. I couldn't find one. But you know, to your point, there are other ones, and there's varying degrees, because what we were looking at was preemptions. So states that came in and said something along the lines of, you have to require ADUs and you have to require ADUs in X, Y, and Z form. You know, there are many states such as Maryland that don't address ADUs, and ADUs are just allowed. So, you know, I'm not familiar enough with Texas or Virginia. I believe Vermont also has some of the preemption. But yeah, as it mentions, this is still under development and we're still looking at other states. But if anyone does know of a national inventory of preemptions, you know, that would be very helpful, as opposed to us just trying to find news articles and that sort of thing. So
Yeah,
thank you.
if you have like especially the bill number or a specific state name of the legislation that you could send us, we could add that as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is important to distinguish between like state legislation that like permits this, or even like incentivize. I mean, it's good to know if it's incentivized, but these really focus on that state level preemption of local zoning authority in some form around accessory dwelling units. That's what these mostly
Right. I
focus
think
on.
we had Izzy on the queue here. You're good? Okay. Oh, yeah, Amy.
So just, I wanted to discuss for a second the whole matter of the short-term rentals in the context of what we're charged to look at. And I think in terms of my previous comment and the way we took a broader approach, I think that the challenges to providing affordable housing, and that conflict between making a property available as a rental as an Airbnb or VRBO investment is one of those challenges. So I just think being aware of those challenges like this one, and being aware of other affordable housing initiatives, while I know our focus is on the ADU, but that full body discussion that we're about to have over the coming months, definitely if we're looking at states that have preempted local zoning, and if we are making recommendations or assessing, I think looking at how whatever we're studying, whatever data we're contemplating, putting that in the context of what is already out there, so that we're not being duplicative, or that we're contemplating some provisions that might have unintended consequences, is important. So I know that we went a little farther afield than we may have intended to, but I still think that is probably a positive scope for trying to grapple with this one particular use, and the unintended consequence of an ADU as an Airbnb is very complicated. And maybe less so in a municipality where there's a structure for licensing and inspection reviews. But I know in a rural community, that is very difficult and very complicated.
Right.
So
Great. Well,
If this is Lori Paris, can I just chime in real quickly about this issue with the short-term rentals? I just wanted to add also, there will be, I anticipate some pushback because in Prince George's County and also in other jurisdictions that I've worked at, there's been a push with respect to the short-term rentals and its impact on affordable housing because of the ease of doing a short-term rental versus having to deal with a tenancy, and then if you have to evict and all the things that come along with that, as well. And I agree with the previous speaker with respect to the licensing and inspection of those units. So I think as we think about the short-term rentals, we need to be prepared to kind of address the concern that I anticipate coming with respect to how that will impact or may impact affordable housing.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for that, Lori. Anyone else online, Susan, that we're missing on this? Okay, great. Good stuff. As you can see, you know, if I had a big whiteboard here, I would be starting to list out all of these things as I kind of have my need to do with markers in hand, but we're getting it all. Another reason we're recording, we can go back to all of this. So Joe, let's go ahead to the next slide then.
Thank you. Okay, so we did an initial planning contact survey. It was distributed on 7/30 or July 31st, and we asked for it August 18th due date, but that was a soft due date. People can still reply. It's still out there. So planning contacts are either planning directors or individuals who oversee planning in a jurisdiction that does not have a planning department, because it's important to note there are a lot of municipalities in this state that have planning and zoning authority, but they're so small that they don't have a planning department. That's very common. Some just might have a clerk and a planning commission. That's their planning department. So we need to keep that in mind when you think the scale is different here for different jurisdictions. We had 60 responses as of today. So that pie chart looks funny. I don't know why it looks like that, but you probably can't see it. So it's important to know this is a self-response strategy or survey, right? People decided self-selecting survey response. It's not like, you know, I'm not a statistician nor a survey expert. We didn't do any like sampling or anything like that. So, you know, the people that wanted to respond to the survey responded to the survey. So keep that in mind. A majority of respondents indicated a very favorable or favorable community response or anticipated community response to proposed or potentially proposed ADU ordinance. So we asked, you know, one of the questions we asked, like, have you either developed or proposed an ADU ordinance? If so, what was the response? You see the number is pretty high there. So very favorable is the blue and favorable is the purple. So the plurality of them were favorable. And then we also asked, if you haven't tried to implement one or develop one, what would you anticipate the response being? And they also, so it was basically the same question. So, you know, I was surprised, you know, we talked a lot about NIMBYism and local opposition, that those who indicated very opposed or opposed combined was only 8% of the respondents. But again, this is a self-selecting survey. So those who are more interested in ADUs, those who might have had more success on this topic, have really developed it locally, are more likely to respond. So I imagine there is more opposition out there, or at least more, not opposition from the planning contacts themselves, but you know, if planning contacts that this is not something that would be likely to happen locally would have answered differently. This priority topics table on the right. So we asked the survey respondents which topics you would like to see the task force prioritize. And these are weighted very, again, I'm not a survey expert. All I did was multiply priority 1 times 3, priority 2 times 2, and the total counts there. So you see that the priority topics that they are interested in this task force addressing are best practices and examples from Maryland, infrastructure capacity, model local legislation, parking, and onwards. You see state legislation at the bottom. Doesn't necessarily surprise me, but we are going to be sending, I'm going to be sending either some form of the exact same survey to you all after this meeting, because I would like to be able to see your position in comparison to what we got from our local planning contacts. I also want to keep in mind, you know, we looked at December and beyond as we continue, you know, we saw a lot of active pickup of this survey. You see the open-ended responses that we received. We're seeing a lot of interest in this topic. So we can develop more surveys. And when we sent this one out, you know, I was saying there may be more coming your way. So those additional surveys, topics, you know, I'd like you all to consider, like, what would we like to find out from our local planning contacts, be them planning directors or those who oversee planning for a jurisdiction. Yes. It was just email. Mhm. That's it's a very strong point. And also, I mean, that leads to the topic. Do we want to interview the general population of Maryland or just planning contacts as well? Because this was just to planning directors and planning contacts. But if the task force, is interested in a broader survey, I mean, you all should need to discuss that. But who's our survey audience?
Yeah, because the planning people that you talk to give a hoot about aging in place, for instance. I mean, are they thinking about that, or are they thinking about their typical everyday work?
Well, the good
Say
news
that
is through the Department of Aging, Department of Disabilities, we'll be using our colleagues to actually utilize some of their resources to reach some of what we know already to be some of the target populations, but so are young people coming back from college. So, or in college or in training school or whatever the boomerang impact may be. And I think that actually gets us to our next slide, which is really the research topics and methods. And I have to just say that we are limited in how much bandwidth we have in terms of our staff time and ability to be as robust as I would love to be if I were back in consulting world and was just doing a full scope of work here. So we do have to be, I think, mindful around the top topics, the primary methods that would work best. And that's what we have here next, I think, to sort of just test out. And we'll probably know more after our October meeting, because as Joe mentioned, some of that broader outreach might be occurring more like January, February, when we sort of have a pretty good sense of what we have so far. So Joe, what is it that you want to focus us on?
I mean, these are like the research topics or methods that we already know we want to do, and we've already started a lot of this. This is not everything. Of course, there are other aspects other topics we could research, other methods to use. So, again, some of these we've already started. Some of them I put up here because they're informed by what we just saw from the planning context survey, what we've heard, what we've seen, the open-ended responses, what we've heard in a couple meetings we've already had with local planning directors, right? So obviously best practices and examples. I mean, the legislation says we need to do that, but you're also, the survey is also saying that that's the highest number one concern, interest. I think this impact on infrastructure and a broad definition of infrastructure. All right, we have somebody who is Jennifer, the name of your slot is very long. Somebody who works professionally in the development and planning of roads and highways, right? I think that's how the language. It's. I didn't get it right.
Tall.
It's on the back there, right? Look at that. See, look at that.
Wow.
It's a lot longer than what everybody else has, but that's what the bill said. So, right, there's the parking. There's that aspect of infrastructure. There's the water and sewer infrastructure. We've seen that, so we know that needs to be addressed. ADU ordinance design, right? And this one comes looking at the local ordinances, looking at the state legislation, but this really getting to that desire for model legislation. And then really this idea of affordability, right? We're here, I would argue that the task force is here to pick, we're going to design the best ADUs. Like these are just like going to be snazzy ADUs. We talked repeatedly here about the need for affordability, right? So we can't lose sight of that as we do our research. And then methods, again, the local and state inventory analysis, any additional surveys, literature, best practices review. It gets back to that qualitative analysis that I said with the no funding we got and the limited time we have, that taking that qualitative approach. And then focus groups and interviews, right? This might involve interviews of all of you all individually, right? To really delve into your expertise, but we could also bring in, we could bring experts into here, or we could have focus groups. And, staff can definitely do this with your support, focus groups and interviews, that more qualitative approach.
we're gonna do this as a round robin so that everybody gets to weigh in. And what I would ask is that, we've put these questions up as prompters, but don't have to go there. What I'd like to do is just do a round robin. We'll once again start with the virtual folks because it's just so hard. And I really want to make sure the folks that are virtual are engaged. But what I would like to, I like doing closing rounds, and now we're not done, because we still have public comments to go. I think at this point, with some of what you've heard, why you're here, we maybe a variety of things that you might want to contribute at this point, but kind of look at it as an opportunity to share with us, not if you're for or against, but things that you think we need to know, things we need to be doing. Basically just your perspective of being here, how you think you can contribute to this. I'm gonna kind of keep it a little open-ended, but try to keep everybody moving at about 2 minutes each. Does that make sense? And sort of just ensure that everyone's weighing in on what we're here and what we're doing. And so we will start with the virtual folks. So Joe, if you could help me with that and just go through the roster there. And then everybody else can be thinking about what closing thoughts you would want to have from today. Do you want this? Here we go. And then you just stand it back.
Okay, we'll start with Delegate Stewart.
Great, thanks very much. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you all again. This has been a really awesome discussion this morning, and I'm really excited to see how the conversation develops over the next few months. I'm happy to just sort of stick to the discussion questions as much as possible. We'll see if I end up wandering off in any other terrain. In terms of barriers, I find it most helpful to think about barriers that are rule-based, in other words, that are in the ordinances themselves that might present a barrier to the construction of ADUs, is separate from barriers that are sort of beyond the rules themselves. So we've talked about a few of these, but I think that most obvious barriers that we're going to have to talk about, and whether or not these are good or bad, depending on your perspective of ADUs writ large. But first, obviously, is the issue of the conditional use or discretionary action process itself. Are these, if we're going to come up with ordinances, are they going to be by right or not? Going through a development process can be lengthy and can be a burden and can be a disincentive for homeowners to pursue a construction of an ADU unit. We've talked a little bit about minimum lot size requirements. These basically mean that ADUs are often prohibited on smaller lots, something we're going to have to talk about. We've talked a little bit about off-street parking requirements. Obviously, this is a hot topic because people don't want to harm existing residents by creating parking problems, but at the same time, it's clear that off-street parking requirements are big barriers to creating ADUs because they drive up the cost of creating these units. We also talked a little bit about owner occupancy. One thing we didn't talk about that we should probably delve into, I certainly understand the reason that jurisdictions, including my own in Montgomery County, have imposed owner occupancy requirements on ADUs. I get it. I think LLC ownership and investment opportunities and landlordism and absenteeism are all legitimate concerns. On the other hand, I think one thing we're going to have to delve into is that those owner occupancy requirements make it much more difficult for homeowners to get the financing required to oftentimes construct these units. Lenders are nervous about providing financing when you have these deed restrictions, and it oftentimes complicates the ability of homeowners to sell both the ADU and the original home when these deed restrictions exist. So that's a really tricky nut to crack, because I totally understand why jurisdictions would want to impose owner occupancy requirements. At the same time, it's also clear that it's an enormous hurdle towards building new units if that's the goal. Sometimes there are affordability terms baked in to the rules. Those can be a barrier. Design constraints can be a barrier depending on how onerous they are. And then briefly, some non-rule based barriers that we have to think about is just how expensive ADUs can be to build, how difficult it can be to get, as I mentioned, to get financing, and just that we're generally talking about homeowner developers here that are inexperienced with this process. ADUs by large in most jurisdictions are not done by professional developers. They're done by homeowners who are not familiar with all these different terms and nomenclature that we've been throwing around this morning. And then finally, just on the research method question, I will just pause and say I think it's so crucial, and it's clear that the committee and the staff that's working on it is taking this seriously. I think it's so important that no matter which way we land or how people individually feel about ADUs at this point in the process, I think it's so important that we ground ourselves in empirics and that we look at the data that exists already. We really do not need to recreate the wheel. I don't think this task force needs a budget. Obviously, we don't have it anyway, so it doesn't matter if we need it. But we don't have a budget in the millions. But I don't really think we need that. I think that even though ADUs are relatively rare in the United States, I mean, if you take a jurisdiction like Portland, Oregon, which is considered this model of ADU booms, I think there's still less than 1% of their housing units are ADUs. So this is a tiny little subset of the American housing population. However, there is a pretty good and developing base of research that's out there. And so before we, jump down rabbit holes and just sort of make assumptions about things, I think it's really, really important that we look at the data that's out there already. So I'm happy to share some of the stuff that I've been researching in preparation for the task force, but there's a number of different studies out there, for example, about ADU's relationship to traffic congestion, ADU's relationship to parking problems, ADU's relationship to sewer problems, surveys of residents who have had ADUs built on their street and what their feedback is. And so I think it's really crucial that, number one, we of course bring our perspectives that we have from all of our different jurisdictions. That's why the legislature created a task force like it did. At the same time, I think that we would be really remiss in doing, I think, all Marylanders a disservice if we didn't take a hard look at every single existing study that's out there already and what they say about some of these issues before we sort of make assumptions or pontificate too much. Happy to share all of those with the task force and with the staff ahead of the October meeting, which I'm looking forward to. And I went way over my 2 minutes, as politicians are wont to do, but it's great to be here and hoping to be in person next time.
Thank you, Delegate. I was timing, but I appreciate all your comments. Really, really good summary. So let's keep moving, and it's try 2 minutes.
Next we'll go to Mr. Gaston, Town of Brentwood.
My apologies. Sorry about that. I'm going to go ahead and reiterate the whole idea about the ADUs and the impact it has on smaller inner city communities, not only inner city, but some larger ones as well. I've been in local government for 25 plus years in 5 different states. And these types of ideas, they sound great, but when it actually goes into practice, some things start to go to the left. I mean, there's always that concept of mom, dad, grandparents, kid come from college. However, in other jurisdictions, how do you determine who's your relative? Who makes that determination? Are you going to actually look at someone's, ancestry to figure out if this person who's living in the ADU is actually related to them? And like I said, in my current jurisdiction of Brentwood, we have a lot of people who technically aren't related, but there's no way we can go in and prove what that is. The biggest concern that I have from a town's perspective is the hit on the city services, and how that will affect someone else's quality of life, if you will. While some people may or may not be able to afford it, other people want to live where they don't have to worry about 4 and 5 cars parked outside their yard, trash, overflowing trash bins, and things of that nature. So there is a negative effect. In regards to research, I have emailed the Mr. Griffiths and Mr. Boyd some information that was regarding what's done or has been done in the city of Phoenix, while the state of Arizona is still reviewing the issue. The city of Phoenix has passed a resolution dealing with ADUs. So I have shared that information with the group, and hopefully he'll share it with the group at large. What resources can you provide the next week? I'll wait till the next meeting and we'll go from there. I am at 12 seconds to my 2 minutes, but I want to thank everybody and thank the committee. And this has been an absolute enlightening experience.
Thank you so much. And thanks for getting all that in there. Great. And we're recording everything. Everybody's writing stuff down madly here. So Joe.
Thank you. The next one is Mr. Griffith. Still on? Check. Hold on one moment. He might have left. It looks like Mr. Griffith left, as did Lori Paris.
Okay,
They both had to
so
step
is
away.
there anyone else?
No other task force members are on virtually.
Okay, so let's go around the room then, and shall we start maybe with Izzy and go around this way this time?
Yeah, I'm going to start with, in terms of barriers or issues, we want to make sure that we'd like to see actionable recommendations, actual recommendations that jurisdictions can act upon, that people can act upon. We want to make sure that what we come up with is accessible for seniors. A lot of designs that I've seen are really not practical for seniors, and them being able to use this space. And of course, affordability needs to be affordable. We're trying to increase the amount of affordable housing for seniors. In terms of research, I'd like to see comparable best practices from similarly situated states that have the same housing issues, the same kind of density and population, so that we're looking at apples to apples and not looking at like Montana, for instance. And I'd be happy to be involved in focus group interview, taking things like that.
Great, thanks, Izzy. Andy?
Yes, hi. Where we think we can help contribute is providing guidelines about accessibility. The Americans with Disability Act was really designed for commercial spaces, and it doesn't always translate seamlessly into residential. So we would like to help guide the task force in providing accommodations for various different types of people.
Great, thanks. Deborah.
Okay, I was remiss to not introduce myself as an architect who first prioritizes sustainability and health in my practice. And we haven't touched on this at all today, so I want to really make sure we do. When we talk about infrastructure, we should also be thinking about natural resources. There was a really excellent article in the New York Times maybe a couple of weeks ago about groundwater depletion around the country, and everyone should read this article. And Charles County was called out as being one of the worst offenders in the country, due in large part to its quick development. And that is an area, I live just across the border from Charles County, an area that is heavily dependent on septic and well water usage. So how is that going to impact, how does that impact that natural resource? So sustainability and health, as long as we kind of use those as overarching guidelines, I feel like we'll be heading in a good direction. And then just from the building perspective, size matters quite a bit. We talk about, I saw a number up there about 800 square feet, somehow that being the limiting number. We talk about tiny houses. I also am actually quite an expert in tiny houses. I could tell you about it. I have a background that you don't want to know.
Now I know.
Okay, that's for a later, maybe like after hours discussion. But anyway, the building code side of it is 800 square feet fits very easily into our building codes. Tiny houses do not. Building codes are being amended to include provisions for structures that are much smaller, like 200 square foot tiny houses. I don't think there's any jurisdictions in Maryland that have adopted those yet. 2021 building codes, maybe they have. Not the ones that I work with. We're still at 2018 at the max. So those are really important considerations, just how we size our spaces. That's all.
Thank you. Great added information. Appreciate it. Exactly what I was hoping to get out of this round. So great, Jennifer.
Thank you. Every time someone speaks, I add more to my list here of things. And one of them actually might be perfect for you. And it was mentioned by Delegate Stewart of the resale considerations, because we really hadn't talked to that at all early on. And that is a huge element of it is, the considerations and the concerns. I do keep coming back when I think through the barriers and the obstacles so much on the infrastructure side, because we've talked quite a bit about affordable housing and accessible housing for seniors, but it's also as within that space, a single, young family or a single parent with a child, and now we have school systems, everything that's based in the infrastructure, utility, of course, being one of the first and foremost on that. But I think those are several barriers as we look at how we look to do implementation. There's a few other items, some I can provide in emails and all of that. But one of the items that I thought, as far as other research methods or sources, I think it'd be very helpful for this group to develop some scenarios and run through those scenarios so we actually can think through as that person there. So as somebody who is senior living, or as somebody who needs accessibility, or as affordable housing components. So it's not just looking at policies overarching, but digging into that detail a little bit further, and perhaps running some of those scenarios as a task force, so we can sit there in the eyes of somebody, when we talk about those actionable things, in the eyes of somebody who's trying to do this, and consider all of those different elements. The last comment I had for today, as we've talked about a lot of information, and I apologize if it went out and I've missed it, but do we have a SharePoint site or something that we'll all have access to as we're doing research or finding resources? Maybe it's just a folder that says more to talk about, to keep it separate from the things that have already been analyzed. But I think it'd be a great way, and possibly easier, Joe, on your inbox.
Whoa, that got loud. Sorry.
Than all of us emailing you.
So quiet.
That's all I have. Clearly.
Sorry. I guess we didn't want to think that. I didn't think well of your SharePoint. State systems are interesting on shared folders, but we will do our absolute best to figure out a way to share information. We can do Dropbox. Yeah. I've just found that in my past life, I would have said, sure. Now I'm like, oh, what can we do?
Yeah.
So we'll keep moving. Tiffany.
So that actually was one of my recommendations for the research methods, just in thinking, or resources that we have, but just in thinking about, as we're all individually doing research, and if someone has the same thing, we can all see what everybody is sharing. And as far as what I would like to bring or provide by the next meeting will be the results from the polls that we have ran, as well as any additional statistics as well. As far as barriers, I think that we have discussed a lot, and I'm sure more will come up. But one that, we discuss in our world is that while, it's allowed, ADUs are allowed on paper, we know that, realistically in some areas, just because it's on paper doesn't mean that necessarily the homeowner can actually do it. So really discussing a lot of those individual barriers in those areas.
Wow, thank you. Yeah.
So the one thing I wanted to touch on is, I think that we need to keep in mind, if one of our overarching goals is about affordability and providing more housing, and partly doing that through ADUs, one thing that we really need to keep in mind is cost and flexibility. And what I mean by that is, like, for instance, if I have an old time carriage house and I was turning my carriage house into a small 1-bedroom ADU, if, by whatever the code requires, and I'm not saying these are bad things, so nobody, if I have to put in sprinklers, that's an added cost. If I have to put in a residential grade elevator, if I have to do whatever those things are, the more those kind of costs add on, then whether I'm an investor or, quite frankly, just a homeowner, that's all going to come into the equation of what it costs to create that ADU unit. And then what I have to charge as rent to rent it out. So we need to be very sensitive. There are very important goals, so don't take me the wrong way. But I think sometimes we lose sight of the fact that, the cost, the marketplace is the marketplace. So we have to be sensitive to cost and the requirements that when someone is doing an ADU, what you require them to do and what the costs are, because those costs are going to end up backflowing into whatever that person is paying rent. And then you might price somebody out. So.
Yeah, really good consideration. Yeah.
Thank you. I'll do mine in reverse order in the interest of time. So I'll be continuing to work with Joe to identify how our two departments can work together on supporting the research needs. and continuing our expansion of looking at jurisdictions in other states, including I think we need to take a look at large cities and counties in other states. I think would be a good next step for myself and us to continue to look at. In terms of research methods and sources, one thing that I didn't bring up to you, Joe, and just thinking of now that I'm potentially engaging with SStat to figure out how ADUs impact assessments. And similarly, either an appraisers association or going out to labor who regulates appraisers to find out how ADUs impacted the appraisal may be a good venue for us to consider. I don't think I have anything necessarily too much to add in terms of additional barriers. Just echo Delegate Stewart and others' points that when looking at how ADUs have been designed in other jurisdictions, many of them just simply aren't impactful because they do retain many of the restrictions that we've discussed. So making sure that we are designing something that actually has an impact and isn't, just so overly burdensome, not to discredit the very legitimate needs of local communities, but aren't so overly burdensome that they lead to, no construction of ADUs. And with that, I'll end my little speech.
Great, thanks, Theo. And on to Dave.
Thank you, Theo. Dave Thaler. First of all, great start, everybody. Madam Secretary, excellent a start. I think we're headed in the right direction, and I think the relatively easy part is to find what other people have done, sort of pick the best practices out of that, and basically come up with a model ordinance. What I'd really like to suggest is what I'd like to hear from is one or two jurisdictions that have actually done it, have it in place, and what their experience has been, good and bad. And maybe that's the city of Phoenix. I don't know. We might have to do that by Zoom, but I would Zoom them in and see what they have to say. I think the chairman has been a little bit more gentle than I would be. Of course, I'm not a very gentle person anyway, in our recommendation. And she has gently proposed this as a recommendation, which of course it is to the legislature. But I think the main obstacles to ADUs are political. And, when you're a local official, when you're a county council person, and you have all your constituents complaining about traffic, as we all saw today, traffic jams all over the place, it's very hard for you to add additional density. You're never going, it's very difficult. Takes an unusual set of public officials. And yet the state has imposed all sorts of things on the jurisdictions: critical area, stormwater management, environmental site design, the tier law. I can't remember the exact name, maybe green growing and something. Can you remember green growing and something else that had tiers? You had to adopt tiers all over the state. And I really think that the state is going to have to impose, if we really want ADUs, it's going to have to come from above. It can't come from below. It's too much opposition. And it may have to come through the vehicle of senior housing, or disabled housing, or affordable housing. But I'm hoping that our recommendation will be for legislation that the state can adopt. Now, I think the chairman's suggestion is the missing piece here, which is what's the economic impact on housing or lack thereof for ADUs. And I suspect, or I don't know for sure, you didn't get any budget to do this. I would suggest that either see if you can find one, or maybe we could seek some sponsorship to help you. I don't know exactly how this works in state government. And I'm not here pitching on Yvonne Bastu, even though I hear him on the radio all the time. But I think we need an econometrician to actually figure this out for us. I think it's beyond our and your abilities, and I think we could find some sponsorship if that's appropriate in the state system. And finally, our office is at the intersection of 695, the Baltimore Beltway, and 70. And I think that's kind of centrally located, and we have a conference center that's more comfortable than this room and available anytime we need it. And so if the task force would like to use it, I would like to offer that all we need is advance notice.
Thank you so much. Thanks for that offer also. Great. Stella.
I'll try to keep to 2 minutes. I think I really echo a lot of what Delegate Vaughn said. I thought he really hit a lot of the stuff. So I'm going to talk about a couple of things that are concerns for me. One is the use of workarounds. And that's what I see going on now. You know, people build an ADU in their basement, in their garage, whatever, and then they leave a stove out, and then it's, you know, legal. So, you know, people are going to they're going to do workarounds. So if we overregulate, if we come up with something that has too many restrictions, it's overregulated, people are simply going to do workarounds. So if you come up with parking restrictions, okay, they're going to park down the street. I mean, we have to keep it simple. If we don't keep it simple, it really is going to just get torn apart when it hits the legislators, and all of our work is just going to get melted away. So I really, really think that's the main thing we need to do. Sure, I care about accessibility, affordability, and aging in place, but we can't say these things have to be accessible and affordable and so on. We have to say this is an umbrella. I think that's my main concern, over-regulating. Okay.
I love it. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you.
I am more than happy to do focus groups and so on. And I can also offer the AARP office in downtown Annapolis
Oh,
for
wow.
meetings. It has a fabulous conference room. So,
Nice.
and it has not lots of IT set up.
Wonderful. Great. Thank you so much. Amy.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to wrap up with the rural perspective, which is why I was invited here. And a lot of the points have been touched on, but I do want to emphasize that from a zoning perspective, we can do this. I mean, this is not a difficult ask in terms of planning and zoning. We've recently updated our comprehensive plan. We have a full-bodied housing element, and that housing element was guided by a 2021 housing study from our Housing and Community Development Office. And so we're working in lockstep. And what I feel is an advantage for me as a planner is our planning strategies are guided specifically by success stories and what doesn't work in our community by our Housing and Community Development Department. So we've identified a lot of things that we can do in terms of being flexible with mixed use development, and accessory dwellings fall under that proviso in terms of providing a diversity of housing stock. But what has been mentioned is the real barrier, because a lot of people point and say, well, zoning, you have all these requirements, but it's not really the case. We set up a land use that's permissible, but then to construct it, you have to meet the building code, and you have to put in sprinklers, and you have to meet the blower door test. You have to meet the environmental standards. You have to, if you're building new construction, you have to address stormwater management. So all of those costs of construction are some of the things that are really what we should be talking about in terms of some of the true barriers to affordability. Some of the things that we're looking at is, well, we already have incentives. We have moderately priced dwelling unit provisions. We have a tiered system to incentivize that development to reduce impact fees, because our county does have impact fees, but not if you're doing affordable housing. So we have a lot of tools in our tool belt, but the market does impact what we're doing. So looking at what is viable and what is doable in our communities has to also be looked at through the lens of what is the political appetite for waiving fees, because we can't legally reduce standards beyond the minimum required at the state level. And there are so many things like building code and like stormwater management provisions and the critical area program. Although I don't think all of those programs are barriers, because for example, the critical area provision, and back to my rural perspective, we have a lot of resource conservation land, which is agricultural land that has critical area zoning. That accessory dwelling unit provision allows for 900 square feet. So, I mean, there are mechanisms in place, but if you're in a rural community, you have an on-site septic system that has to manage 1 or 2 dwelling units, a nutrient removal system requirement, and with the building code, you need to have a sprinkler system, which means you need to have an extra tank to hold that water. So there are lots of ways we can go about, from a planning perspective, providing this opportunity, but we have to look at those other barriers. And the only resource that I don't think we've mentioned, and she just walked out of the room, but I work a lot with our Bay Association of Realtors. They have a lot of housing analysis and housing data that we use and that helped us to craft a more realistic comprehensive plan section that addresses some of our housing needs with some real numbers. So I would just mention that our area, the Maryland Association of Realtors, they do have a lot of great housing data. So
Great, thanks, Amy. Okay, well, as promised, we have public comment. So I'm going to take that and see if we can improvise here and make this happen. So you all have been so patiently waiting here and listening. Now's your chance. I saw one arm go up here, so let me on the same timer. Yeah, here you go.
My name's Joe Tetlow. I work for the Department of Legislative Services with the Maryland General Assembly. I just seems like legal counsel would be helpful for the task force as far as if you're going to make a legislative recommendation, you need to know what kind of legislation the General Assembly can pass. And my understanding, I'm not an expert, is the authority that is given to the local zoning boards is authority delegated in the statute by the state. So the state delegates the authority to the local governments. And it just seems it's important for you to know what legislation can be passed. So it will help you make a recommendation. So I don't know, it seems like legal assistance might be helpful. That's just my comment.
Believe me, nothing will move forward, but thank you for that comment. Other comments from anyone that's here? Okay, great. Why don't you, can you step out this way, and then I think there's, our camera system here. Introduce yourself, and I've got the timer on.
I think it's good morning.
It still is.
Good morning, everyone. And I thank you for an opportunity to speak to you today. My name's Maxine Gross. I'm a resident of the Lakeland community within College Park. And I'm sure many of you have heard of College Park before. So we have some unique concerns around housing, particularly around the crowding that has been caused by the University of Maryland and their decisions on housing their students within the school's boundaries, and also additional decisions made around the building of a lot of high-cost apartment buildings. Unfortunately, that's caused a lot of pressure on the individual communities to house students at a more reasonable cost. And one of the big challenges to that is the whole regulation around 5 unrelated people being allowed in a single family home. There seems to be a lack of ability to actually police that. And one of the things that I've heard a number of times is the concept of permitting ADUs in circumstances where they were inhabited by a family unit. And I don't know, while I really think that is a really positive concept, and it's actually one that I've advocated for in our own community, I don't know that it's practical. I hope it is, but I think that barrier would have to be really studied carefully before it was thought to be a conceivable way of policing the whole circumstance. I'd also like to say we're counting on you. We're looking to you to come up with something great. I come from a neighborhood that was largely demolished through urban renewal. And a lot of the vestiges of that are coming back to haunt us right now. So I'm saying to you, good luck. May the force be with you. And I'll be keeping an eye out for you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being here and your comments. Thank you. Any other comments? Yes, here we go. Introduce yourself and I start the
My name
timer.
is Matt Freuder on the legal counsel. I'm actually a recent retired lawyer, which is good. I took a job as the CEO of a company called Great Outdoor Cottages on the Lower Shore. It started making park models. I don't know if anybody knows what that is, but it's a small house that sits on a trailer.
Oh, yeah.
So we set up a factory a couple of years ago to make those. And just recently we moved into the IBC, IRC type models and have placed ADUs in Worcester County. Whoever's familiar with Worcester County, workforce housing is a huge problem down there. Land isn't. You know, you can hit a 5-iron from the boardwalk and get to a farm field. So land we have, zoning we have challenges with. So the ADUs are now allowed in Worcester County. We've placed a couple. We're starting to build some. We've got stamped drawings for one, you know, with sprinklers and meets the whole IBC code. So, and we've gone through some financing issues, and as somebody had raised that as well. So, we have a developer that's an affiliated company that has a lot of experience in that as well. So we're here to see kind of what the plan was and to provide some insight if we can, because we can build 5 of them a day, you know, and so volume and affordability. And I was just speaking with Theo and showed him it's, you know, when it's a low income housing, people have a perception that it's unattractive, but it doesn't have to be. It can be something that you can be proud of to live in and call your home. And so that's why we're here. So thanks so much for.
Well, thank you. Appreciate that. Yes. Good information. Yes. Do we have another comment? Here we go.
Hi, everyone. I'm Victoria Olivier. I'm a community planner at Howard County, where ADUs are like kind of, sort of, a little bit allowed under some extreme circumstances. But as part of our comprehensive planning update, which is now 3 years and still going, this is part of our dynamic neighborhoods chapter. And so we're really interested in how you all are going to do work that helps support us in implementation. But I just wanted to bring up sort of this balance between communities that are in the comprehensive planning process versus maybe the zoning rewrite process, or kind of getting down to brass tacks, because we have our share of ADU anxieties, a lot of which have been mentioned today, you know, anything from what if there are families living there, will this, you know, overcrowd our school system, and just kind of like understanding what the real scale of this is, you know, versus a tool in the toolbox of a very complicated process. And so, you know, I wouldn't dismiss the sort of the visuals, the softer side, because we really are still selling this on the ground floor, to open the door to all of the different, you know, regulations that we've spoken about today. So, you know, as you're doing literature reviews, I would also say, like, what are the visuals? I'm really glad there's an architect here who can help kind of, you know, make this more personal. And so I just wish you good luck, and we're happy to be a part of a focus group or whatever you guys need.
Great. Thanks so much. Thanks for your comments. Everybody good? And don't forget, those of you on, yeah, I'm checking our time. Yes, quick question.
The College Park lady, the College Park lady, I heard your good wishes, but I didn't hear what you exactly would like to see come out of this group.
Well, I think the planning director for the city may be on Zoom as well, but I'm going to ask, I'm an individual and I'll be answering for myself only. I'd like to see some guidance on how this thing can actually work in a community, and some tools that individual municipalities or counties can use in order to make that happen.
Great, thank you. Really appreciate y'all taking the time and being here today. And to those of you virtual, you know, use that Google form, because I think, you know, we are very interested in getting everyone's feedback and input. I think we've all, I hope, learned already today so many different aspects of this particular issue. One more thing, Joe, before I close. We have 4 minutes. Okay. I promised that we would end on time, so I want to make sure we stick to that. I would just, really like to close with, we've got a big job ahead of us, and I hope you're still with us and for what we signed up for. No one was scared away. And I think it's just really critical that everyone keep an open mind, everyone stay balanced, everyone really understand that there are multiple aspects to this thing that have to be considered. And the best we can do, I think, is be thoughtful in our guidance, balanced in our guidance, and definitely look for best practices and lessons learned from other areas. That's going to be big, and we're going to really count on all of you for that. I love the fact that innovation is coming out of crisis, which we often find. Let's look for those examples of innovation and ways to maybe do this slice of responding to what we all, I think, can agree on is there's not enough housing. If we really want to grow our economy and support our people, there's not enough housing. And so we can agree on that. This is one slice. There's multiple other slices. And so maybe by tackling this slice, it will shed light that can be helpful, I think, in other aspects of this overall challenge we have in Maryland, which is around housing for all. So with that, I am going to close, and I am very appreciative to those online. I'm sorry, but I just know that we need to sort of stick to our guidance on that, and we will get the poll out to get the meeting scheduled through the year. We will definitely look at the offers we've had of where to be, and look at ways to share information. I think those are all be important to having this be a very robust process. But in the end, I will crack the whip and we will funnel in towards an outcome. That doesn't mean it's sort of like you've got to come out with the film, right? But everything doesn't end up and stay on the cutting room floor. There is going to be a lot of other things that I think will come out of this. So thank you all. And I think we're off to a good start. I'm really excited about the expertise and the energy we have here. So thank you all.
Thank you.
With that, I will adjourn the meeting officially. We can shut us down on the recording and turn off the mics.